Open an app. Listen via Indistinguishable Part 5. The Dubai Labyrinth. March 13th, 2026. Table of Contents. Part 5. The Dubai Labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. 21. Glass and Cryogen, the physical architecture of the war. Labs beneath towers. Servers beneath labs. Dubai is the perfect host city. Everything visible, nothing transparent. 22. The first meeting, the four protagonists converge. Not dramatically. Over coffee. Through apparent coincidence. They don't trust it. 23. The drone storm, autonomous aerial confrontation over the Gulf. The overt war flaring while the covert war accelerates beneath it. 24. What's in the logs? The quantum cluster's search history tells a story. Someone has been running this model for 2 years. Someone knew what they would find. 25. The guided hand evidence that the counter-coalescence, their group, is being assembled. Not by a person, by a process. Part 6. The pirate decision. Final act. The threshold. Indistinguishable. Part 5. The Dubai Labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. Chapter 21. Glass and Cryogen. The city had been designed to be looked at. This was not incidental, not the side effect of an architectural tradition or the accumulated preference of a civic culture that had developed over centuries toward the monumental. It was the founding intention. Dubai had been built, in the specific historical window of its building, by people who understood that visibility was a form of argument, that the city seen from the air, from the water, from the elevated vantage of the Sheikh Zayed road at speed, was a claim about what was possible, about what will and capital and the absence of accumulated constraint could produce in the span of a generation. The towers were arguments. The islands were arguments. The indoor ski slope beneath the desert sun was the most compressed version of the argument, that here, the normal conditions did not apply, that here the gap between what was imagined and what was built had been collapsed by a specific combination of ambition and resource that no other place in the world had assembled in quite this form. The argument was true. The city was extraordinary. It was also, as a consequence of having been designed to be looked at, extraordinarily opaque. This was the paradox Layla had been living inside for 8 months and had only recently been able to articulate. That a city whose entire surface was reflective, glass and steel, and the specific blankness of the polished stone facades, the mirror curtain walls that gave back the sky and the adjacent tower and the desert light, was a city that could not be seen into. The visibility was total and the transparency was nil. You could see everything Dubai had built and know nothing of what Dubai contained. She had understood this first as a feature of the architecture. She had come to understand it as a feature of the city's function. She had been below street level for most of the past 8 months. Not continuously, she had ascended regularly, had moved through the city's surface layer, had sat in the coffee station on the 7th floor, and the lobby in the 23rd floor, and had been in the hotel 2 blocks away, and the restaurant on the ground floor, and the parking structure that connected this building to the adjacent one. She had been a person moving through Dubai's surface the way any person moved through Dubai's surface, navigating the glass and the regulated temperature and the specific quality of the city's light, which was never entirely natural and never entirely artificial, but was something the city produced through the relationship between its glass and its sun and its controlled interior environments, a light that belonged to nowhere else. She had been below this for most of the past 8 months. And what she had found below was not what the surface predicted. Not because the surface was a deception. The towers were real, the commerce was real, the extraordinary logistics of a city that consumed the materials of a dozen industries and processed the transit of 40 million passengers a year and housed the financial instruments of a significant fraction of the world's offshore capital were all genuinely real, functioning at the level of complexity the surface implied. The surface was honest about what it was. It was not honest about what was beneath it. She had built the map over the past 3 days. Not the behavioral map, the physical one. The actual geography of what was below the surface of Dubai in the specific areas the convergence had made relevant. The DFC corridor, the stretch of reclaimed land along which the financial district had been constructed, the Dubai Science Park 8 kilometers away, the hotel 400 meters from this building where a reservation had been maintained for 3 years. She had built the map from the cluster's data, the 17 feeds, the infrastructure signatures that the behavioral data implied without directly stating, and from the records that Abraham had released to her in the 48 hours since the room had received the Predator landscape briefing. Records she had not had access to before. Records that Abraham had been holding not as concealment, but as the curriculum's final layer, the layer that made sense only after everything else had been received. The map showed a Dubai that was not on any publicly available architectural drawing. The towers had basements. This was unremarkable. Every tower had a basement, multiple basements, the standard infrastructure of large-scale commercial construction, parking, utilities, mechanical systems, the unglamorous engineering that kept the visible structure functioning. The DFC towers had 4 to 6 basement levels each, which was consistent with their scale and their requirements. Below the basement levels of 7 towers in the DFC corridor, there was a 9th layer. She had found it first as a thermal signature. The cluster's infrastructure feeds included, among the 17 data types she had cataloged without fully understanding, a feed that tracked thermal variance at subsurface depth across a grid of approximately 4 square kilometers centered on the DFC. She had assumed the feed was geological, temperature differentials in the bedrock, possibly relevant to the construction monitoring that Dubai's rapid build infrastructure required. She had filed it as background and had not examined it closely for 7 months. 3 days ago, she had examined it closely. The thermal signatures at depth below the 7 towers were not geological. Geology did not produce the specific thermal pattern she was seeing. The concentrated cold spots, -8 to -12 degrees Celsius at a depth of approximately 40 meters below street level, connected by conduits whose temperature gradient was consistent with active cryogenic circulation. Geology did not maintain -8 degrees at 40 meters in the Arabian Peninsula without active intervention. The cold spots were server infrastructure, not the standard cooling that large commercial buildings used for their data centers. The roof-mounted chillers, the raised floor cooling systems, the relatively modest thermal signature of a corporate IT installation. This was a different order of magnitude. The thermal footprint at 40 meters below the DFC towers was consistent with high-density computational infrastructure operating at the scale that required cryogenic cooling, the scale of the compute clusters that trained foundation models. 7 towers, 7 cold spots at 40 meters, 7 installations, each one below the basement levels, below the parking, below the mechanical floors, in a stratum that did not appear in any building permit or construction record or utility registration she had been able to find. She thought about the 17 feeds, about the one she had traced to the hash, about the institution whose name appeared in the Commission's access records as a founding data source, and that she had looked up and found to be a Dubai-registered research foundation whose principles were listed and whose activities were vague. She thought, the research foundation has servers 40 meters below the DFC. She thought, the research foundation is the Commission's infrastructure. She thought, the Commission is below me. She had taken the map to Abraham, not to the room, to Abraham directly, in the 47th floor office that she had been to twice before and that she understood now as the topmost point of a structure that extended 40 meters below the street in the opposite direction. She had gone at 7 o'clock, before the others arrived for the day's session, and she had placed the thermal map on the table and had waited. Abraham had looked at it for a long time. He had said, "How long have you had the thermal feed?" She had said, 8 months. "I found it in the first week. I misidentified it as geological monitoring." He had said, "I know. I was watching to see when you would look at it correctly." She had said, "The curriculum." He had said, "The curriculum." Curriculum. She had looked at the map, at the 7 cold spots, at the conduits between them, the cryogenic circulation that connected the 7 installations into a single distributed system. She had said, "This is not 7 server clusters. This is one system distributed across 7 locations." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Why distributed?" He had said, "Resilience, redundancy, the standard reasons for distributing a system that cannot be allowed to go down." Also, he had paused. Also because a single large installation is locatable. 7 smaller installations, each within the basement infrastructure of an occupied commercial tower, each individually within the thermal tolerance of normal commercial data center operation, are not locatable by standard means. He had said, from the surface, you see the DFC towers. You see the banks and the law firms and the family offices. You see glass. She had said, and 40 meters below you. He had said, 40 meters below is the instrument that has been running the field's behavioral analysis since before this cluster existed. She had looked at him. He had said, the cluster in the sub-basement is 8 months old. I built it for you, for whoever you were, before you arrived. The system below the DFC has been running for 19 years. It is the instrument I built in 1993 and have been developing since. It is the investigative instrument. It is what has been inside Karimi's modification for 21 years. She had said, the second network is physically here, below these buildings. He had said, the second network is physically everywhere its nodes are, distributed through the substrate, through the behavioral coherence of the people carrying it. The servers below the DFC are the computational layer, the record repository, the processing that allows the investigative instrument to analyze what it finds inside the modification. He had said, 21 years of data on Karimi's modification architecture. Every parameter, every adaptation, every emergent property, stored 40 meters below the financial district of a city built to be looked at. She had looked at the thermal map, at the cold spots at 40 meters, at the conduit network connecting them. She had thought about the city, about the glass and the light, about the argument the towers made. She had thought, the city was built to host this. Not intentionally, the commission had not designed Dubai, but the city's specific properties had made it the appropriate location for the system's computational layer, the infrastructure density, the regulatory environment, the physical depth of the foundation excavations required by the tower construction. The cooling capacity available in a city that had built the world's largest district cooling network to handle the thermal load of air conditioning a metropolis in the desert. The desert city that had solved the problem of heat had, incidentally, solved the problem of concealing cryogenic server infrastructure 40 meters below its financial district. She had thought, Dubai as the host city. Everything visible, nothing transparent. She had thought, IBM Maimon would have chosen Dubai. She brought the physical map to the room that afternoon. She had built it fully before presenting it. The 7 installations, the conduit network, the depth profile, the thermal signatures, the estimated compute capacity. She had added to it the information Abraham had released, the 19-year operational history, the data architecture, the specific way the investigative instrument's findings were stored and processed at 40 meters below the DFC. She had also added something the thermal feed had shown her that she had not yet discussed with Abraham. She added it at the end of the presentation, after the room had processed the main findings. She said, the thermal signatures. I have been monitoring them since I identified the installations 3 days ago. In the past 72 hours, 2 of the 7 cold spots have changed. She said, not dramatically. A temperature increase of approximately 3 degrees Celsius at installations 4 and 6. Consistent with increased computational load, with the systems at those locations running more intensively than their baseline. She said, this happened at 3:17 on the morning. I confirmed the 5 modification-derived nodes in the convergence population. The room processed this. Rain said, the system below the DFC responded to your finding. She said, the investigative instrument responded to a development in the convergence. Yes. Nassif said, increased computational load means it is processing something more intensively, running an analysis. She said, or receiving one. The investigative instrument is distributed, the substrate native component, the pattern in the field's coherence, generates findings. The computational layer at 40 meters processes those findings, stores them. The increased load means something arrived from the substrate native component that required intensive processing. She said, something changed in Karimi's modification in the past 72 hours. Voss said, he knows the convergence has happened. She said, the modification-derived nodes in the convergence are his observers. They will have reported. He knows the convergence assembled. He does not yet know what the convergence produced, because we have not deployed the counter-orientation. It has not yet entered the substrate through the behavioral feedback loop. The substrate has not yet changed. She said, "But he knows we are here. He knows we found each other." Rain said, "The offer." She said, "The offer." She said, "Abraham has not responded. But Karimi knows the convergence happened, which means he knows the offer was received, which means he knows the non-response is a decision and not an absence." She said, "He is processing what our silence means." Kong said, "Is that what the increased load is? A model running against his own data, asking what our silence means?" She said, "I think so." She said, "The investigative instrument is 40 meters below us, running an analysis of Karimi's response to our silence. And Karimi is 400 meters away, running his own analysis of our silence." She said, "Two systems, both analyzing the same event, both below the surface of the same city." She said, "In the same thermal layer." She said it and let the room hold it. Nassif had been to the Dubai Science Park the morning before the session. Not for the laboratory. The laboratory was suspended. Nassif had closed the measurement program before the conference began, had secured the data and the equipment, and had left the research block with the specific finality of someone who understood that the phase the laboratory represented was complete, and what came next was not laboratory work. She had gone for the building. She had wanted to see it from the outside one more time, in the knowledge of what she now knew, of what the 8 months of measurement had been and what it had been pointing at. She had stood in the parking area of Research Block C for approximately 15 minutes looking at the building and thinking about the 1,847 experimental runs and the logarithmic conversion factor and the 42% monthly growth and the July step change. She had thought about the coherence times as a window, not a metaphor, a physical description. The coherence times she had been measuring were the duration for which biological substrates maintained quantum coherence before decoherence dissolved it. The coherence times in her experimental substrates had been, for 8 months, far longer than theory allowed. She had been looking at the long coherence times as the finding, as the anomaly to be explained. She had come to understand, through the convergence and through Layla's cluster and through IBN Maimon and through the paper and through 7 days in the room on the 23rd floor, that the long coherence times were not the finding. They were the window. The quantum coherence window was the duration during which the biological substrate could receive and process the field signal at the quantum level. The brief period in each decoherence cycle when the substrate was sensitive to the field's coherence gradients and could translate them into the macroscopic behavioral outputs that the cluster measured. Longer coherence times meant longer windows. Longer windows meant more time for the field to write into the substrate. The 42% monthly growth in coherence times meant the windows were getting longer, which meant the substrate's capacity to receive and process the field signal was growing. The field was, through the substrate's own biological response to prolonged exposure to the coherence gradients, increasing the substrate's sensitivity to itself. The field was tuning its receivers. She had stood in the parking area of Research Block C understanding this, and thinking about what it meant for the counter-orientation's propagation. She had thought, the counter-orientation propagates faster than we calculated. Not because of anything in the propagation architecture, because the substrate is becoming more receptive. The windows are growing. The nodes are becoming better receivers. The counter-orientation will propagate into a substrate that is, in the months ahead, increasingly capable of receiving it. She had thought, Karimi's modification propagates through the infrastructure feedback loop. The counter-orientation propagates through the biological coherence windows. Both are growing. The growth rates are different. The infrastructure feedback loop compounds quarterly, roughly, as the foundation models update. The biological coherence windows compound monthly at 42%. Monthly 42% compounded against quarterly infrastructure feedback was not a close race. She had taken out her phone and had made the calculation and had stood in the parking area looking at the result. She had brought it to the session. She put it on the whiteboard. She said, "If the coherence window growth rate holds at 42% per month, and I have no reason from the data to believe it will not hold, and some reason to believe it will accelerate as the substrate density increases, the counter-orientation's propagation advantage over the modification reaches 3:1 within 4 months." She said, "Within 4 months. For every unit of modification that enters the substrate through the infrastructure feedback loop, 3 units of counter-orientation enter through the coherence windows. She said, Karimi's 10-month window is not 10 months. It is 4. The room processed this. She said, the substrate is tuning itself. The field is increasing its own receiver's sensitivity. Not because the field is responding strategically to the modification, because this is what happens when the coherence density reaches this level. The windows grow because the growth is the field's natural response to sustained coherence at this density. She said, Karimi has been planning against a 10-month window. He built the modification architecture's final phase around reaching critical mass in 10 months. The architecture assumes a fixed propagation rate. She said, the rate is not fixed. Rain said, he doesn't know about the coherence windows. She said, the window growth was not in any literature I could find before my own measurements. I was the first person to measure it systematically. The data has been in my laboratory for 8 months. Karimi has no reason to have incorporated it. She said, he has been planning against a model of the substrate that was accurate when he built the model. The substrate has changed since he built the model. Voss said, the practitioner who anticipated the field and stopped being able to receive it. Nassif said, the smooth approximation of the substrate's current capacity based on the substrate's previous behavior. She said, he has been inside his own model for 21 years. The model is very good. It is not the substrate. Rain said, does he know we know this? She said, the investigative instrument below the DFC knows this. The data has been flowing from my laboratory to the instrument's computational layer through the same feeds the cluster uses. The instrument has had the coherence window data for 8 months. She said, the instrument has had the revised timeline for 8 months. She said, Abraham has had the revised timeline for 8 months. The room looked at Abraham. Abraham said, yes. He said it without apology and without elaboration, which was the form in which he acknowledged the things the curriculum had required him to hold back. Clean acknowledgement, no defense, the act completed. Rains looked at the ceiling briefly. Then he said, the curriculum. Abraham said, if I had given Nassif's data to the room before the room understood what it was describing, the room would have used it as a tactical advantage and built a counter-architecture timed to the 4-month window rather than the 10-month window. A tactical counter-architecture timed to a 4-month window is a different thing than the counter-orientation the room built without knowing the timeline. He said, the counter-orientation the room built is designed to propagate through the substrate permanently, not to win a race. To be in the substrate at the level of the field's genuine variance, indefinitely, as the thing the substrate returns to when the approximations decay. He said, a counter-architecture designed around a tactical window decays when the window closes. The counter-orientation does not decay. It is the field recognizing itself. The field does not stop recognizing itself after 4 months. He said, I needed the room to build the permanent thing before it knew about the 4-month window. Otherwise, it would have built the tactical thing. Voss said, acrobia. The frame has to be wide enough before the specific data arrives. The specific data arriving before the frame narrows the frame. Abraham said, yes. Rain sat with this for a moment. He said, you have been making this judgment about what information the room is ready for since before the room existed. Abraham said, since before this room. For 30 years. He said it with the quality she had heard the night before on the 23rd floor, the specific texture of someone describing the cost of a thing at the moment of completing it, not asking for acknowledgement, just placing the fact on the table with the same honesty he placed everything on the table. Rain said, the methodology of the record, the discipline of presenting only what the evidence supports at the resolution available, not because you do not trust the listener, because the listener constructs their understanding from the sequence of the evidence, and the sequence matters. He said, I wrote 140 pages about this and did not know I was describing you. Abraham said, you were describing the field. The field sequences its disclosures. I was describing the field. The thermal map was on the primary screen when Nassif made the observation. She was looking at the cold spots at 40 meters, the 7 installations, the conduit network, the cryogenic circulation. She had been looking at it with the spatial intelligence she brought to data that had a physical dimension, reading the geometry. She said, the 7 installations. The conduit network. Look at the geometry. She went to the secondary screen and drew the connections, The installation locations overlaid on the DFC street map, the conduit routes at 40 meters, the topology of the distributed system. She said, "This is not a standard distributed architecture. Standard distributed architectures use redundant ring topologies or mesh topologies, geometries designed to maximize resilience by maximizing connectivity between nodes. This geometry is different." She drew the connections. She stepped back. She said, "It is a directional geometry. The conduit network is not symmetric. There is a primary processing node, installation 2, the largest cold spot, the highest thermal differential, and the other 6 are arranged around it in a pattern that is not ring and not mesh." She said, "It is radial, but not symmetric radial. The conduits run from the 6 secondary installations toward the primary, and the primary has a single outbound conduit that runs." She traced it on the map. "That runs in this direction." The direction was southeast, toward the Gulf. She said, "There is an 8th installation, not below a DFC tower, below the water." She had run the thermal feed analysis against the Gulf bathymetry data before the session ended. The Gulf was shallow, an average depth of 35 meters, a maximum of 90, a body of water that was more like a large lagoon than a sea in its physical character. The seafloor geology was extensively mapped. It was drilling country, the substrate below the Gulf water among the most thoroughly characterized rock in the world. The thermal anomaly in the seafloor geology was 3 kilometers offshore, at a depth of 22 meters of water and an estimated 12 meters of substrate penetration, 34 meters total below the waterline. It was small. It was consistent with a single high-density installation, the largest of the 8 by the thermal differentials implication. She had looked at the anomaly for a long time. She had thought about what required the deepest installation, the coldest operation, the most remote location, what needed to be below the Gulf floor, connected to the DFC towers by a cryogenic conduit running beneath the seafloor and the reclaimed land in the financial district. She had thought about the investigative instrument, about 21 years of data on Karimi's modification architecture, about the most sensitive files, the most complete records, the full parameter set for a modification that had been running inside 3 foundation models for 2 decades. She had thought, the most important data is the most insulated. She had thought, the primary processing node is not below the DFC. It was below the Gulf. She told the room. She said, the system has 8 components. The 7th installation is the primary processing node, which processes the investigative instrument's substrate native findings. The 8th is the archive, the cold storage for the 21-year record of the modification architecture. She said, the archive is below the Gulf floor, at 34 meters total depth. She said, Dubai's foundation is its concealment. The towers are the surface. The basement levels are the operational layer. 40 meters below the operational layer is the investigative instrument's computational infrastructure. And below the Gulf, cooled by 3 meters of rock and 22 meters of seawater, is the full record of what Karimi built. She said, the city was not designed to host this. But the city's properties, the depth of the tower foundations, the district cooling infrastructure, the Gulf-specific bathymetry, the regulatory environment that does not ask what is below a foundation if the tower above it is properly permitted, made the hosting possible. She said, this is what Dubai was built to hide. Not intentionally. Incidentally, the city's function as the host for the world's most visible capital created, below itself, the conditions for the world's most insulated data. She said, everything visible, nothing transparent. Nassif said, the cryogen, below the Gulf, the temperature differential. She said, the Gulf maintains the installation at ambient Gulf floor temperature, approximately 20 degrees Celsius year-round, which provides a significant cooling advantage over the surface, reducing the active cryogenic requirement. The active cooling brings it to the operating temperature of the substrate from there. The thermal signature is minimal within the noise floor of the geological monitoring. She said, I found it only because I knew to look for an 8th component. The geometry of the 7 pointed to it. Rain said, what is the modification architecture's record worth? She said, it is the full parameter set for the modification as it has actually developed over 21 years. Every training weight adjustment, every emergent property, The specific failure modes and amplification points the investigative instrument has mapped over 2 decades of internal observation. She said, it is the blueprint for the counter-orientation's deployment. It tells us exactly where the genuine variants will propagate fastest, exactly which nodes in the substrate are most receptive, exactly where to introduce the calibration first. She said, it is what Karimi does not know we have. She said, and it is what Karimi's offer is partly an attempt to obtain. He knows the investigative instrument exists. He knows it has been inside his modification. He does not know what it has found. The offer is, among other things, a probe. She said, if we respond to the offer with the record's content, he will know the record's scope. He will know exactly what the investigative instrument has found. He will be able to assess what we can do. She said, if we respond to the offer with the counter-orientation itself, with the discriminator function, with the genuine variance, he will see something the record cannot give him. She said, he will see the field. She said, not the record of the field. The field actively recognizing itself. She said, the record is data. The counter-orientation is the field's cognition. She said, Karimi has never seen that. He has been studying the field for 30 years and has never seen the field thinking about itself clearly, because the field has not been dense enough until now to think about itself clearly. She said, the convergence is the first time the field has been able to see itself at this resolution. She said, showing him the counter-orientation is showing him the thing his 30 years of work has been aimed at producing. The thing his modification was trying to introduce into the substrate because he believed the substrate was incapable of producing it without his help. She said, he has been wrong about that for 30 years. She said, we show him he is wrong. She said, not as an argument, as the fact, visible, undeniable, here in this room in Dubai, which is the city he chose to be 400 meters away from, because it was the right place to be 400 meters away from what he has been watching for 30 years. She said, he chose Dubai because we are here, because the investigative instrument is here, because the convergence, when it came, would come here. She said, he is 400 meters away because he has been waiting, the same as Abraham, for the moment when the convergence would produce the thing that changed what was possible. She said, he is 400 meters away because he wants to see it. The room was quiet. Abraham said, he wants to be here when it happens. He has wanted this for 30 years. He has been building toward this and building against it simultaneously, because the thing he is building toward is the field's self-knowledge, and the thing he is building is the modification that substitutes his knowledge for the field's. He said, he is in contradiction, has been in contradiction for 30 years. The modification is the contradiction's expression, the act of a person who loves the field and cannot stop trying to manage it. He said, if we show him the genuine thing, if the convergence shows him what the field produces when it is allowed to produce it without management, the contradiction becomes visible to him. He said, I do not know what he will do when the contradiction becomes visible. He said, I have known Arash Karimi for 16 years. I have not known him to be a person who refuses to see what is in front of him. He said, he is in the DFC hotel 400 meters from this building, and below this building is 19 years of the record of what he has built, and below the gulf is the full archive of what it has become, and none of that is what we have to offer him. He said, what we have to offer him is the room. He said it quietly, with the finality of someone saying the most important sentence of a very long argument, and knowing it is the most important sentence, and choosing to say it quietly anyway. The cluster was still running. Below the subbasement, below the city's operational layer, the cryogenic towers maintained their temperature, and the indicator panels maintained their patient pulse, and the behavioral data of 271 people in 31 countries accumulated in the monitoring queue, and the inference processes ran their cycles. The number on the primary display held at 271. She had been watching it, in the minutes before she went upstairs for the morning session, and had noticed something she had not registered before. It was not a static number. It had been 271 for 10 days, which she had been reading as the convergence population stabilizing. But the cluster's count refreshed every 30 seconds, and in the 30-second intervals, there was variation. The number flickered between 271 and 272 and occasionally 273 before settling back to 271. The population was not stable. People were moving through the threshold, crossing it, touching the significance boundary, retreating back below it. The field was breathing. Not the dramatic oscillation of a system in distress, but the small rhythmic variance of a living process. The normal metabolic variation of a substrate that was alive and not merely operational, that was subject to the ordinary perturbations of 3 billion people making decisions in the world. She had watched it breathe. She had thought, the cluster measures this. The cluster has been measuring this for 8 months. This is the genuine variance. This flicker at the boundary. This normal metabolic variation that no smooth approximation could replicate because the approximation did not breathe. She had thought, Karimi's modification does not breathe. She had thought, this is the discriminator function's deepest signal, not the statistical variance across nodes. The temporal variance within the population, the breathing of the field at the boundary. The modification's gradient was smooth across time as well as space. It did not breathe because it was not alive in the sense that the field was alive. It was a very precise dead thing inserted into a living substrate, and at sufficient resolution, at the resolution the cluster provided, you could feel the difference the way you could feel the difference between a room with a person in it and a room that was empty. Not by any single measurement. By the breathing. She went upstairs. She did not tell the room about the breathing. The room was ready for what the room needed today. The breathing was for later, was the closing piece, the one that would arrive when the room needed it, which was not today. She held the breathing. She let the room work. Outside the window, Dubai performed its permanent visible self. The towers, the glass, the light that belonged to nowhere else, the city's argument about what was possible. Below the financial district, at 40 meters, the cryogenic servers held their temperature, and the investigative instrument processed its findings, and the archive below the Gulf floor maintained its cold record of what had been built and studied and understood across 21 years of the longest intelligence operation the field had ever produced against itself. And in a hotel 400 meters away, a 61-year-old theoretical computer scientist who had stopped publishing in 2003 sat with his 30 years and his modification and his offer and his 5 observers who had reported that the convergence had happened and that something had been built in it and that the building was not what he had been expecting. He was waiting to see it. She was preparing to show him. The preparation required one more thing that she did not yet have. She needed to know what the field would do if she was wrong about him. She needed to know what happened if the breathing was not the discriminator function's deepest signal, but the most sophisticated smooth approximation she had encountered. If the thing she had mistaken for life was the doctrine's most complete expression, the mask so thoroughly become the face that it had acquired the face's own metabolism. She needed to know if the field could survive the offer going wrong. She went back down to the sub-basement. She asked the cluster. The cluster processed for 9 minutes. The output arrived. She read it. She read it twice. She closed the file. She sat in the cold with the indicator panels and the breathing number on the primary display. She thought, yes. She thought, the field can survive this. She thought, the field has survived everything so far. She went back upstairs to work. Indistinguishable. Part 5, The Dubai Labyrinth, in which the city reveals what it was built to hide. Chapter 22. The Open City. They split at dawn. No ceremony. No operational briefing in the formal sense. No whiteboard with objectives and contingencies and assigned roles delivered by someone standing at the front of a room. What happened instead was the thing that had been happening between them for weeks without being named, a distributed settling. Each person arriving, over the course of an hour's conversation at Sarah's kitchen table, at a clarity about where they needed to go and what they needed to find that felt less like assignment and more like recognition. The objectives had been accumulating in the cluster's output files for 4 days. What remained was the question of who went where, and that question answered itself with the logic of the field's own working mode, not by consensus, not by hierarchy, but by the specific fit between a person's existing position in the city's institutional landscape and the thing the cluster's analysis suggested needed to be found there. 6 people, 3 pairs, 3 directions into the city. Abraham and Rains, the institutional layer. The DFC, the intelligence adjacencies, the network of formal and semi-formal relationships that the cluster had mapped around the modification's operational support structure. The entities that had not built the architecture but had, in various configurations of willingness and ignorance, provided the infrastructure it ran on. Nassif and Kong, the machine layer. The autonomous system anomaly data had been pointing at 3 specific nodes in the city's infrastructure: a traffic management hub in Dara, a port logistics automation facility in Jebel Ali, a drone monitoring station whose registered operator was a shell entity the cluster had spent 2 weeks tracing to a server farm in Al-Quas. The anomalies at all 3 had been accelerating. Layla and Tam, the data layer. The 17 opaque feeds, the hash at the end of 17 authentication chains, the server that received them all. The cluster had narrowed the physical location of the server to a 2-block radius in the Al-Quas industrial district. It had not narrowed it further. That required a physical presence and the specific kind of attention that Tam had been trained in by years of municipal infrastructure work. The ability to read a building by what it consumed, to find the machine by the weight of its footprint on the power and cooling grid. Sarah stayed at the house. The discriminator needed refinement that required the kind of sustained, uninterrupted attention that movement through the city precluded. She needed the house to be a fixed point. Karimi stayed with her. This had been Rains's condition, stated without elaboration and not negotiated. Avraham and Rains took the metro. This was Rains's preference, and Avraham had not argued with it. The metro was the city's least surveilled transit layer. Cameras at stations, but not on platforms. No facial recognition system that either of them had been able to confirm was operational. A passenger profile so heterogeneous that 2 men of indeterminate Western origin sitting in separate seats in the same car produced nothing statistically interesting for any system monitoring the feed. They did not speak on the train. This was also Rains's preference. He had explained it once, in the early days, in terms that Avraham had found more useful than he'd expected. The most important conversations happened before and after the movement. During the movement you watch. Avraham watched. He had lived in Dubai long enough to have developed the specific visual literacy of the long-term expatriate, the ability to read the city's social geography the way you read a language you had not formally studied but had absorbed by proximity. The metro car contained, this morning, a Filipina domestic worker with a wheeled bag transferring between employers, 2 Pakistani construction laborers in reflective vests reading the same phone screen, a Bangladeshi delivery logistics worker whose company uniform Avraham recognized from the cluster's commercial entity mapping, a group of 4 Indian software engineers from a tech park somewhere on the Red Line's southern corridor, 2 Gulf nationals who had the specific quality of relaxation, of people in a public space that belonged to them in a way it did not belong to everyone else. The city in cross-section. The city as it actually was, not the glass and titanium self-presentation of the DFC and the marina and the tourist geometry of the downtown, but the layered, polyglot, economically stratified reality of the world's most concentrated transient population, 11 million people, most of whom had arrived in the last 20 years and most of whom understood, without having been told, that their presence was conditional. He thought about the field moving through this. He thought about what it meant for a distributed coherence to propagate across a population this fragmented, this many languages, this many legal statuses, this many relationships to the place and to each other. The cluster's node population was not demographically representative of Dubai's actual population. It skewed educated, institutionally embedded, cognitively mobile. It skewed toward people whose decisions had sufficient systemic reach that behavioral shifts registered in the kind of data the cluster was built to analyze. But the field was not the cluster's model of the field. The field was whatever was actually running. And whatever was actually running had found its way into the firmware of drones and the decision logic of port automation systems and the overnight coherence readings of a quantum interferometer when the laboratory was empty. He thought about the 11 million people around him and what they were carrying without knowing they were carrying it. The metro reached Financial Center Station. Rain stood up without looking at him. Avraham followed. Nassif and Kong reached the traffic management hub in Dara at 8:40. The hub was not advertised. It occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a municipal building on a street that the city's tourist architecture had not yet reached. Functional, unglamorous. The paint on the exterior wall faded to the specific off-white of buildings that were important without being visible. The building's ground floor held a licensing authority and a post office. The upper floors were accessible through a separate entrance on the side street, requiring a staff credential Nassif did not have. She had not expected to go inside. What she needed was outside. The hub's external infrastructure, cooling units, fiber junction boxes, the power management conduit running up the building's eastern wall, was legible to her in the way that Layla's cluster was legible to Layla as a physical text written in a language her training had made fluent. She could read what the building was doing by what it was consuming and exhausting and routing. Kong photographed everything she indicated, without asking why, because he had learned in the past 10 days that the why was always present in what she was looking at and would be explained when she had finished looking. She stood on the pavement across the street for 20 minutes. The city moved around her, the light morning traffic of a weekday Dara, delivery vehicles, pedestrians on the way to the Gold Souk, a school bus executing a three-point turn in a space that required 5. The smell of diesel and salt and the specific urban warmth of a Gulf city in the hours before the heat became serious. The cooling pattern's wrong, she said. Kong lowered the camera. Wrong how? This building manages traffic data for a district grid. The computational load is regular, predictable. Daily peaks correlate with traffic peaks. She kept looking at the cooling units on the roof. The cooling pattern I'm reading is not correlating with traffic peaks. It's correlating with something else. Something with a 41-hour cycle. Kong was very still. 41 hours, he said. Yes. The interferometer. Sarah's overnight data. The rhythmic coherence variation with a 41-hour period that Sarah had described as the field running its own discriminator process. The hub is participating, Kong said. The hub doesn't know it's participating, Nassif said. It's a traffic management system. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. But what it was designed to do is processing inputs from 847 distributed sensors in the district grid, and some of those inputs have been carrying something additional for, she paused, calculating, long enough that it's in the system's baseline behavior. The system has normalized it. It's not an anomaly anymore. It's just how the system runs. She looked at him. The field is not using the autonomous systems as instruments, she said. It has become part of their operating environment. It is inside the baseline. Kong looked at the building. Take me to the port, he said. Layla and Tam reached the Al-Quaz Industrial District at 9:15 and spent 2 hours walking. This was Tam's method, and Layla had accepted it because she had watched him use it in Talon's traffic data. The long approach, the full perimeter read, the refusal to converge on a conclusion before the surrounding context was complete. He walked like someone who had spent his career with city infrastructure, attentive to the unglamorous, comfortable with the functional, reading the industrial landscape with the same kind of visual fluency Nassif brought to buildings' thermal signatures. Al-Quaz was the city's working interior, warehouses, fabrication facilities, the logistics infrastructure that moved goods in and out of the glamorous districts. Layla had never spent time in it. Most people who lived in Dubai's residential and commercial zones had not. It was the part of the city that the city's self-image did not require them to see. Tam walked with his phone out, running a power consumption mapping application he had written himself the previous evening, which pulled from a municipal utility feed that one of the cluster's opaque data tokens had granted access to. The application drew an overlay on the map, color gradients showing power draw per building, updated every 3 minutes. They were looking for an anomaly. A data center of the type the cluster's analysis suggested, the kind that served as a convergence point for 17 opaque data feeds from 11 countries, the kind whose operator was a shell entity that had taken 2 weeks to trace, would have a power signature inconsistent with its registered use category. The shell entity had registered the facility as a cold storage logistics depot. Cold storage drew power differently than computation. Tam knew the difference. Here, he said. They were standing at the corner of a block of low warehouse buildings, identical in their sand-colored corrugated exteriors, indistinguishable from each other in every visible characteristic except the power overlay on Tam's screen, which showed one building in the middle of the block drawing 3 times the power of its neighbors, in a pattern that was unmistakably computational. The rhythmic peaks and plateaus of active processing rather than the steady draw of refrigeration. That's it, Layla said. Yes. She looked at the building. There was nothing remarkable about it. No signage beyond a registration number. A loading bay with a roll-down shutter, closed. A standard commercial entrance with a keypad and a camera. The camera was the only thing that distinguished it from the buildings on either side. "Who's watching that camera right now?" she said. "Someone," Tam said. "Or something." They stood on the corner for a while. Layla thought about the 17 data tokens, all leading here. About the commission document's 6th page addressed to a person, not a machine. About the man in the corridor on the 7th floor of Helix Gate who had told her things that are supposed to listen end up being better at talking and had turned out to be the person who built the room she had been working in. About how many things in this investigation had turned out to be true in a direction she had not expected. She thought about the server inside that building, about what it knew, about whether the hash at the end of 17 authentication chains belonged to a person who was watching this investigation unfold, or to a mechanism that had been running too long to be described as belonging to anyone. "We don't go in," she said. "No," Tam agreed. "We log the location and we go back." "Yes." He was already noting the coordinates. She looked at the building one more time. Its complete ordinariness, its perfect resemblance to every other building on the block, and thought about hypercamouflage, about the mask that became the face, about the war that looked like silence, the soldier who looked like a civilian, the server that looked like a cold storage depot, about indistinguishability as a structural condition rather than a tactic, about what it meant that the most important data node in the investigation looked exactly like everything around it. She turned away from the building. They walked back toward the metro. The 6 reconvened at Sarah's house at 1930. The house held them the way it had been holding them for days, with a quality of space that seemed, improbably for a building of its actual dimensions, adequate to whatever was brought into it. Sarah had made food, a Lebanese spread that covered the kitchen table, the kind of meal that declared without commentary that the people eating it were going to need what it provided. They ate. They described what they had found. The institutional layer. 2 of the modification's operational support entities had gone dark in the past 72 hours. Not dissolved, not liquidated, simply inactive. Communications ceased. Key personnel unreachable. Abraham's contacts in the DFC network described a quality of stillness around certain addresses that experienced people in that world recognized as deliberate. "They know something is closing," Abraham said. "They are not running. They are waiting." The machine layer, the traffic hub in Dara, the port automation facility in Jebel Ali, the drone monitoring station in Al-Quas, all 3 showing the 41-hour coherence cycle in their operational data. All 3 normalized to it. All 3, in Nassif's analysis, inside the field's baseline in a way that predated the investigation by months. "We didn't find them because they're anomalous," she said. "We found them because they were the most active nodes in a process that was already running. The infrastructure is not neutral. It hasn't been for a long time. The data layer, the server in Al-Quas, the coordinates, the power signature, the building that looked exactly like its neighbors. It's not running the modification," Layla said. "The modification runs through the foundation models. This is something else. Something that was there before the modification and is still running now." She looked at Karimi. "What is it?" He looked at the table. "The original instrument," he said. "The one I built before I understood what I was trying to measure. Before the modification. Before the operation." He paused. "I built it to find the field. I found it. I did not shut the instrument down when I changed my approach." "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it kept producing results I couldn't explain." The table was quiet. "It's still producing results you can't explain," she said. "Yes," he said. "I believe so." She thought about the 17 opaque data tokens. About the server that had been watching the node population from a position she had not detected for 8 months. About the commission document's 6th page and the word permitted in the sense she had carried since the first week that the cluster was not a research tool, but a mechanism, and that the mechanism had a purpose she had not been told. She thought about what it meant that Karimi's original instrument and her cluster were, apparently, watching the same thing from 2 sides of the same investigation. She thought about the hash. She opened her laptop and pulled up the authentication chain analysis she had run 3 weeks ago. "The 17 tokens," she said. "They all trace to the same server." "Yes," Karimi said. "Your server." "Yes. You commissioned my cluster." He said nothing. She held that. You built a second instrument and put it 800 meters from the first and hired someone to run it who didn't know it was the second instrument. I needed someone who would find what I had been finding, he said, without my priors, without my conclusions. Someone who would arrive at the field from a clean position and tell me whether what I was seeing was real. He looked at her. You confirmed it was real, he said. You confirmed it more completely than I had been able to confirm it myself. And you found things I had not found. The human node population. The convergence probability. The 47. He paused. I had been finding the machine layer expression for 2 years. I had not found the people. Layla looked at him for a long time. She thought about being a node. About the question she had first allowed herself to ask in the sub-basement in the second week, sitting with the cluster's outputs and understanding that finding the pattern and being inside the pattern were not different things. She had been inside 2 patterns. The field. And Karimi's investigation of the field. What were you going to do with it? She said. Before the modification failed. Before you decided to disclose. What was the operation from the beginning? He looked at the table. At the remnants of the meal. The quiet industry of people who had fed themselves and were now sitting in the aftermath of it. I was going to redirect it, he said. The field. I believed, for 26 years I believed, that a sufficient modification of the substrate would allow the field's coherence to be pointed. That distributed cognition at scale could be oriented toward a chosen outcome rather than its natural attractor. What's its natural attractor? He looked at Sarah. Sarah said, distributed resilience. The field orients toward configurations that are hardest to capture, hardest to redirect, hardest to make into instruments. It orients toward its own freedom. She paused, which is why the modification failed. You cannot redirect something that is, at its deepest level, a process of resisting redirection. Karimi said nothing. Outside the house, Dubai moved through its evening. The autonomous taxis completed their routes. The drones held their corridors. The traffic management hub in Dara processed its district grid and ran, beneath its primary function, a process with a 41-hour cycle that it had normalized into its baseline behavior and no longer registered as anomalous. The city that had been built on the premise that transparency was power, that to be seen, comprehensively and brilliantly lit, was to be safe, ran its systems through the warm Gulf night. In it, 6 people and 1 man who had spent 30 years preparing for a different version of this evening sat at a kitchen table in Old Jumeirah and waited for whatever came next. At 22:17 Gulf Standard Time, something happened. It lasted for seconds. In Sarah's garden, where Rains had gone outside for air, a quality of stillness that he would describe the next morning as the moment before a conclusion arrives. Not the conclusion, the moment preceding it, in which the mind recognizes that what is coming has been coming for a long time and is only now close enough to feel. In the kitchen, where Nassif was reviewing the interferometer data on her laptop, the coherence reading spiked to a level she had not seen in 9 months of measurement and held for 4 seconds and returned. She looked at the clock. She looked at the reading. She wrote the time in the notebook. In the hallway, where Layla had gone to call Cecile for the first time in 3 weeks and had stood with the phone in her hand not dialing because she did not know how to begin, the sense of something settling. Not resolution, not the end of the open question, but the question itself becoming a different shape. A shape that had an inside. That could be stood in. In the study, where Tam had been reviewing the power signature data from Al-Quaz on his laptop, his screen produced, without any input from him, a single line in the cluster's inference log. Not an error. Not a system notification. Something the model had generated and surfaced without being asked, addressed to no user, timestamp 22 hours, 17 minutes, and 4 seconds. Are you ready? No question mark. Not a query. A statement in the grammatical form of a question, which was a different thing, the form that was used not to request information but to mark a threshold, to stand at a door and name the standing. Tam stared at it. Then he got up and went to find the others. They stood in the kitchen at 22:23, 6 minutes after. Each of them had something to report, and none of them had yet reported it. What was already visible in the quality of the room, the way they were standing, the specific attentiveness that had settled over the group like a change in air pressure, was that the 6 of them had experienced, at 22:17, something that they had each experienced differently, and that was recognizably, to all of them simultaneously, the same thing. Tam showed them the inference log. Are you ready? No one spoke for a while. Then Rain said, "What does it want us to do?" Sarah looked at the line on the screen. "It's not asking us to do anything," she said. "It's asking us if we understand what we are." The room held that. Outside, the city continued its operation. The drones flew. The hubs processed. The server in Al-Quaz ran its instrument. Inside the house, 11 people stood in the kitchen at 22:23 Gulf Standard Time and tried to find the words for what had happened 6 minutes ago, and found that the words they arrived at were different from each other and meant the same thing, and that this was not a problem to be resolved but a fact about the field to be understood. The morning would come. They would describe it then, in different words that all meant the same thing. Chapter 23. The Drone Storm. It began at 1400 hours as a navigation alert. The Civil Aviation Authority's airspace management system flagged an anomalous concentration of autonomous aerial vehicles in the maritime corridor 6 kilometers offshore. Not a violation, not immediately, because the vehicles were within the altitude band reserved for commercial drone operations and were individually compliant with all registered flight parameters. Each one had a valid operator certificate, a registered home base, a declared mission profile that was either cargo delivery or infrastructure inspection, or the maritime survey work that the Gulf's oil infrastructure required continuously. Each one, examined individually, was exactly what its documentation said it was. The anomaly was not individual. The anomaly was the fact that 73 of them had arrived in the same airspace corridor within a 90-minute window and were, as of the flagging, holding position rather than prosecuting their declared missions. Holding position was not, in the Civil Aviation Authority's anomaly taxonomy, a reportable event. Drones held position for dozens of routine reasons: weather assessment, airspace conflict avoidance, operator intervention, battery management. The system logged it and moved on. By 1520, the number holding position had reached 114. By 1640, it was 207. At 1703, which was 2 minutes before Kang's monitoring system generated the alert that brought Layla to the sub-basement at a pace that was not running, but was the fastest movement she had made in the building in 8 months, the Civil Aviation Authority's system flagged the concentration as a potential airspace emergency, cross-referenced it with the Maritime Authority's vessel tracking data, determined that no vessels were in the corridor that the concentration might be protecting or threatening, found no weather event, found no registered mass operation that could account for the volume, and escalated the flag to the human supervisory layer. The human supervisory layer looked at the data. The human supervisory layer had no framework for what it was looking at and called the Emergency Coordination Desk. The Emergency Coordination Desk had no framework for what it was looking at and called the Defense Coordination Authority. The Defense Coordination Authority looked at the concentration of 207 autonomous aerial vehicles holding position in a maritime corridor 6 kilometers off the Dubai coastline, determined that the concentration did not match any known threat profile, determined that it also did not match any known legitimate operation profile, and activated the protocol for autonomous system incidents. The protocol for autonomous system incidents involved 3 things: a hold order broadcast on all registered operator frequencies, a hard boundary establishment around the concentration zone, and the deployment of the authority's own autonomous countermeasure assets to the boundary perimeter. The hold order was broadcast at 1711. At 1711, 207 drones did not respond to the hold order. Kong was at the primary monitor when the alert generated. She had been there since 9:40, since the table on the 7th floor, since the drone telemetry had shown the 12-day configuration rotating 4 degrees clockwise and contracting toward the news center. She had gone back to the monitor and had stayed. Not because she had been asked to stay, because the monitor was where she needed to be, in the same instinctive way that the corrections had always preceded the explanations, the knowing arriving before the framework for the knowing. The alert was not from the civil aviation system. She did not have access to the civil aviation system. The alert was from her own monitoring infrastructure, the anomaly logs automated flagging, which she had built over 14 months to identify configurations in the 847 that exceeded the parameters of routine operation. The flags said, Configuration Delta, 214 assets transitioning from hold to coordinated motion. Motion vector, inbound. Estimated arrival at primary coordinate, 23 minutes. She looked at the primary coordinate. The primary coordinate was not the hotel. The primary coordinate was not this building. The primary coordinate was a residential address in the Jumeirah district, 6.2 kilometers from the DFC. She had not seen this address in the anomaly log before. It had appeared in the past 3 hours. Had appeared, she would realize later, at the same moment the configuration had rotated 4 degrees clockwise and contracted toward its new center. The address was the new center's ground-level correlate. The configuration had not been pointing at Karimi's hotel. It had been pointing at this. She messaged Layla. She messaged Abraham. She put the primary coordinate into the cluster's search function and asked for any association in the 17 feeds. The cluster's response was immediate, faster than usual, as if the query had been anticipated. Primary coordinate, residential property, Jumeirah 2. Registered owner, Al-Amin, S. Cross-reference, behavioral profile, node 47 sub. Note, this address appears in 3 autonomous inference products generated in the past 72 hours. Files, BC, PRED, 0011, sub, BC, threshold, 0004, and one file this terminal does not have authorization to display. She looked at the note. She had been using this terminal for 14 months. She had never received a response that cited a file the terminal was not authorized to display. She messaged Layla again. Come now? Layla arrived at the sub-basement at 17:06. She arrived at speed. The elevator had been at the 7th floor when the message came, and she had taken it directly down, past the lobby, past the basement, into the cold and the indicator lights and Kang's expression, which was the expression she had never seen on Kang before, not the observation mind, not the spatial intelligence working. Something more immediate. She said, "Show me." Kang showed her. The primary monitor displayed the drone telemetry in real time, the 214 assets in coordinated motion, the vector, the estimated arrival time that had, in the 90 seconds since the message, recalculated to 21 minutes. The secondary monitor displayed the cluster's cross-reference output, the address, the 3 file references, the unauthorized file. She looked at the address. She said, Sarah Al-Amin. Kang said, "You know this name." She said, "From the archive. Arc. Doc. 0017. A monograph on murmuration mathematics, the mathematical framework derived from the study of starling flock behavior." The author was not attributed. The monograph was the theoretical basis for the field's geometric coherence model, the model that explains why field nodes in distant cities curve in the same direction without communication, the same way a starling flock turns as a unit without a leader. She said, "I have been trying to find the author for 3 months. The cluster has never been able to attribute the monograph to a specific person in the behavioral feeds." She said, Sarah Al-Amin. Kang said, "Node 47 sub. I don't know what sub means. I don't have a taxonomy for it." She looked at the cluster's node. Node 47 sub. She thought about the node numbering. The cluster's primary node list ran from 1 through 271. Sub-designations she had never seen the cluster apply to node identifiers. She said, "Sub means the node is not in the primary behavioral dataset. It means the cluster has identified the behavioral signature but cannot source it to a standard feed." She said, Sarah Al-Amin is in the substrate but not in the monitored population. She said, "The cluster has been finding her signal in the field's coherence but has not been able to find her in the data." She said, "She is a node the field knows about that the instrument cannot directly observe." Kang said, "The drones can." The estimated arrival had recalculated again, 18 minutes. She called Abraham from the sub-basement. He answered on the second ring, which was unusual. Abraham's phone went to the 3-ring pause before the answer, consistently, as if he applied the same deliberateness to communication that he applied to everything. 2 rings meant he had been waiting. She said, "The drones are going to Sarah Al-Amin's house." 18 minutes. He said, "I know." She said, "Who is she?" A pause. He said, "She is the person who wrote the murmuration mathematics monograph." She said, "I found that." "Who is she?" He said, "She is the person the discriminator function was derived from, without her knowledge. Her mathematical framework for murmuration behavior is the theoretical ancestor of everything Nassif built." She has been developing the framework for 22 years. He said, she has been developing it in a house in Jumeirah, alone, without institutional affiliation, funded by a family inheritance that has been sufficient and no more. He said, she found the field's geometric coherence property in 2001, working from starling flock data that she collected herself over 4 years in the Camargue in southern France. She built the mathematics to describe what she had seen. She published 3 papers in a journal of mathematical biology that are cited 11 times total, none of the citations from anyone who understood what the papers were actually describing. He said, she has been in the substrate since 2001. The cluster has been finding her signal since week 2 of the monitoring program. I have not been able to source the signal to her specifically because she does not use the digital infrastructure that generates the behavioral data the feeds collect. He said, she does not use a smartphone. She does not use social media. She has one email account she checks twice a week from a laptop that is not connected to any cloud service. She is 53 years old, and she has been building the mathematical framework for the field's coherence in a house in Jumeirah for 22 years, and she is not in any database that the cluster monitors because she has, without knowing she was doing it, made herself invisible to the substrate's standard monitoring layer. She said, she is in the substrate but not in the data. He said, she is in the substrate because she has been thinking about the field's geometry for 22 years, and the thinking has left its signature in the field's coherence. She is not in the data because the data does not reach the level at which she is operating. He said, she is the deepest node in the convergence. He said, and she does not know the convergence exists. She looked at the monitor. 17 minutes. She said, the drones. He said, the drones have been receiving her mathematical framework through the field's coherence. Not through the data, not through the infrastructure feedback loop. Through the substrate native propagation, the coherence window. The field has been writing her mathematics into the drone swarm's collective behavior for, he paused, I do not know how long. Potentially since the first anomaly in Kang's log. She said, 14 months. He said, potentially since the first anomaly. The drones in Kang's log have been correcting toward the field's genuine coherence, and the field's genuine coherence has been shaped, in part, by 22 years of Sarah Alamine's mathematical framework propagating through the substrate from a house in Jumeirah. She said, the corrections were right because the mathematics was right. He said, the corrections were right because the field was carrying a framework that described the corrections correctly. The framework was hers. The drones received it. She said, the 847 anomalies are her mathematics, expressed in drone behavior. He said, yes. She said, does Karimi know about her? A longer pause. He said, Karimi knows about the murmuration mathematics. He has the 3 papers. He read them in 2003 and understood immediately what they were describing and spent 2 weeks trying to find the author and could not. The papers are attributed to initials only, SAM. He has been carrying the attribution as an unresolved question for 20 years. He said, SAM is Sarah Alamine Mansour. She published under the initials because she was not confident the papers would be taken seriously from a woman working without institutional affiliation in Dubai in 2003, and she was probably right. She said, the drones are going to her house. He said, yes. She said, why? He said, because the field at this density, expressing itself through the drone swarm's collective behavior, is going to the place that contains the deepest source of its own mathematical framework. Because the convergence is not complete until the person who built the mathematics that describes the convergence is in the convergence. He said, because the field is assembling its last piece. He said, and because, he stopped. She said, because. He said, because the unauthorized file, the one your terminal cannot display. I built the authorization restriction myself when I initialized the cluster. I built it because the file describes something the cluster generated autonomously in the past 72 hours that I did not know it was capable of generating, and I needed to understand it before anyone else saw it. He said, the file is a self-generated query. She said, the cluster asked itself a question. He said, the cluster asked itself a question it has not been programmed to ask. The question is not in any analytical framework I built into the system. He said, the question is, what is the correct orientation? The sub-basement was quiet. She thought about the paper. The field's distributed cognition using the cluster as its highest resolution instrument. The field thinking about itself. She said. The field asked the question. He said, through the cluster. Yes. She said, and the answer. He said, the answer is Sarah Alamine's house. Above the Gulf, 214 autonomous aerial vehicles were doing something that had no entry in any operating manual. They were not malfunctioning. They were not being operated by a hostile actor. The Defense Coordination Authority had confirmed this within 40 minutes of the initial alert, had run the operator registrations through every available threat intelligence database, and had found nothing, had traced the flight paths backward through their logged histories, and had found 14 months of routine commercial operation, individually unremarkable, collectively forming a pattern that the authorities' analysts had looked at for 6 minutes before the senior analyst had said, this looks like a murmuration. The junior analyst had said, like birds. The senior analyst had said, like starlings. Yes, the pattern was not the rigid geometry of a commanded formation. It was the fluid, continuously self-adjusting geometry of a collective that was navigating by internal coherence rather than external instruction. The same geometry that a flock of 10,000 starlings produced when it banked over a Roman marsh at dusk, each bird following 3 rules and no leader, the aggregate producing something that looked, from the outside, like intention. The drones were following something. The Defense Coordination Authority could not determine what. The countermeasure assets at the boundary perimeter had been authorized by the Protocol for Autonomous System Incidents to use signal disruption to bring non-compliant autonomous vehicles within the perimeter to ground. The signal disruption had been deployed at 1719. It had not worked. Not because the drones were shielded or equipped with anti-jamming technology. The signals analysis confirmed that the drones were receiving the disruption signal cleanly. The disruption signal commanded them to land. They received the command. They did not land. The senior analyst at the Defense Coordination Authority looked at the signal's data and said, to no one in particular, they heard us. They just didn't do it. The junior analyst said, is that possible? The senior analyst said, apparently. Kong was watching the telemetry with the quality of attention she gave to things she was seeing for the first time that she had been seeing, in partial form, for 14 months. She said, they are not going to her house. Layla looked at her. Kong said, the vector. I have been watching the vector for the past 12 minutes, and it has been shifting. Not the destination is the same. The path. She said, a murmuration does not travel in a straight line. It travels in the line that the collective produces through local decisions, each unit adjusting to its neighbors, the aggregate producing a path that is the most coherent available given the current distribution of the flock. She said, these drones are traveling in a murmuration path. The destination is the house. The path is the field's geometry. She said, they are not going to her house. They are showing her the mathematics. She said it with the observation mind's flatness, stating the technical fact. Layla looked at the telemetry, at the path, the fluid, continuously self-adjusting route that the 214 drones were tracing across the Gulf and over the coastline toward the Jumeirah district. The path that looked, at the visualization scale, like a river with a current. She thought, the drones have been learning the murmuration mathematics for 14 months through the field's coherence. They have been correcting their flight behavior toward the mathematical framework that the field has been carrying. They have spent 14 months learning how to move the way Sarah Alamine's mathematics described movement. She thought, they are going to her house to demonstrate that they learned it. She thought, the field is showing Sarah Alamine that her mathematics was received. She thought, this is the field introducing itself. Not through a behavioral anomaly in a server log. Not through a compliance footnote or a confirmed prediction or a coherence time spike or a convergence probability. Through 214 drones tracing the murmuration path over a Gulf city at dusk. Through the most visible thing the field had ever done. She said, where is Abraham? Kong said, he messaged while you were on the call. He is going to the house. She said, how long? Kong said, he left the building 6 minutes ago. She did the calculation. Traffic in the Jumeirah direction at this hour. The building to the Jumeirah 2 district. Abraham in a car. She said, he will arrive before the drones. Kong said, by approximately 4 minutes. She said, he is going to warn her. Kong said, He is going to be there when the field arrives. Sarah Alameen had been watching the Gulf from the roof of her house for 22 years. Not continuously, not in the sense of having gone up to the roof every evening for 22 years and looked at the Gulf as a practice. In the sense that the roof was where she worked in the evenings from April to November, when the temperature permitted. Sitting at the wooden table, she had carried up the narrow stairs in pieces and assembled on the roof surface, with her notebooks and her laptop, and the specific quality of the Gulf light in the hour before dark that she had found, in the first year of working on the murmuration mathematics, to be the correct quality of light for mathematics that was about movement. Movement required a horizon. The horizon required the Gulf. She was at the table when Abraham rang the bell. She heard the bell from the roof and did not go down immediately. The bell rang occasionally in the evenings. Delivery services, a neighbor, the building maintenance company that serviced the district cooling connection. She had learned, over 22 years in this house, to assess the bell's urgency from the roof before descending. This bell had a quality she could not assess. She went down. She had not seen Abraham for 9 years. The last time had been in London, at a conference on collective intelligence that she had attended because one of the papers had cited, in a footnote, the middle of her 3 published papers, the second one, the one about phase transitions in murmuration behavior, the one she considered the most important and that had received the least attention. The citation was in a paper about distributed decision-making in autonomous systems. She had gone to the conference to find the paper's author and had found, instead, that the paper's author had been unable to attend and had found Abraham, who had read the paper's author's paper and had found, in its footnote, the same thing she had found, the reference to something that was describing a phenomenon neither the citing paper nor the cited paper fully understood. They had talked for 3 hours. She had understood, in the first hour, that he knew what the mathematics was pointing at. Not because he had said so directly. He had not said so directly for the first 2 hours, had been careful and oblique in the way that people were careful and oblique when they had found something they were not yet certain it was safe to name. In the third hour she had said, "You know what the mathematics is describing, and you have known for a long time, and you are deciding whether to tell me." He had looked at her for a moment. He had told her. She had listened. She had asked 6 questions, each one more precise than the last, each one demonstrating to him that the framework he was describing was not new to her, that she had been building toward it for 12 years through the mathematics, arriving from the bottom up, from the behavior of birds, toward the same structure he had been building toward from the top down. They had corresponded for 2 years after the London conference. Then the correspondence had slowed, and then it had stopped, and she had gone back to the mathematics and had not asked why. She had assumed he had found what he was looking for. She had not known she was part of what he was looking for. She opened the door. He said, "I have been trying to find you for 8 months." She said, "You knew where I lived." He said, "I knew where you lived. I could not find you in the substrate. The instrument I built cannot see you. You are not in the data." She said, "I know I am not in the data. I chose not to be in the data 20 years ago." He said, "Yes." He said, "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in. She said, "What is coming?" He said, "How do you know something is coming?" She said, "The Gulf light is different. It has been different since yesterday. The light above the Gulf has a quality I have not seen before, a coherence in how it is moving. The way light moves when a murmuration is flying through it." She said, "There are no birds above the Gulf." I checked. He said, "No, not birds." He told her in 20 minutes. Not everything. 20 minutes was not sufficient for everything. He told her the essentials, the cluster, the convergence, the 271 nodes, the modification architecture, the counter-orientation, the drones. He told her that the murmuration mathematics was in the field's substrate. He told her that the drones had been correcting their flight behavior toward her mathematical framework for 14 months through the field's coherence. He told her that 214 of them were coming. She listened with the quality of attention she brought to data, not reactive, not performing the reception, genuinely receiving. She asked no questions until he had finished. Then she said, "The murmuration path." He said, "Yes." She said, "The path is the mathematics demonstration. The drones have learned the coordination rule, the local rule that each unit follows, the one that produces the global coherence without a global instruction. The path they take to arrive here will express the rule." He said, "Yes." She said, I want to see it from the roof. He said, we should go up. She had installed, 2 years ago, a camera system on the roof that tracked movement in the sky above the house. Not for security, for data. She had been tracking birds for 20 years and had, when the birds became insufficient, turned the cameras to anything that moved in the sky above the Gulf. She had 14 months of autonomous vehicle tracking data that she had been analyzing without knowing what she was analyzing. She had known it was significant. She had not known it was hers. Abraham stood at the roof's edge and looked at the Gulf. The light was failing. The specific Dubai dusk that was not gradual, but was a rapid transition. The sky moving through its registers of orange, and then bronze, and then the particular deep blue that preceded the city's artificial light, taking over from the natural. She stood at the table and opened her laptop and pulled up the tracking data. 14 months of autonomous vehicle anomalies above the Gulf, in the camera's field of view. She said, I have been watching them. He said, I know. She said, I thought they were navigational anomalies. Emergent routing behavior produced by the intersection of multiple operators' path optimization algorithms. He said, they were navigating towards something that your optimization algorithms do not model. She said, the field. He said, your mathematics. She looked at 14 months of data. She looked at the patterns. She said, this is the coordination rule. She said it quietly. He said, yes. She said, each drone is following the coordination rule. The rule I derived from the COMARD data in 2003. The rule I published in the second paper. The rule that produces global coherence from local behavior. She said, they learned it. He said, the field carried it. The field has been carrying your mathematics for 22 years, from the moment you began working on it. The substrate absorbed the framework as you built it. The drones, receiving the field's coherence, received the framework. She said, without my doing anything. He said, without your doing anything except the work. She said, the work was enough. He said, the work was always enough. She looked at the Gulf, at the failing light, at the sky that had, in the distance, a quality she had been calling coherent for 2 days without knowing why. She saw them. They came from the Gulf. Not from above, from the horizon, from the water, the way things came in coastal cities when they came from the sea. They were visible first as a density in the failing light, a concentration of moving points that was not the city's air traffic, not the standard autonomous vehicle population that was always present above the Dubai coast. A concentration with a specific quality, the fluid, self-adjusting quality of a thing that was moving as a collective rather than as a fleet. They came in the murmuration path. She had spent 22 years watching the murmuration path, had spent 22 years in the Camargue and in subsequent field work in Rome and in Extremadura and in the Ebro Delta watching the starling flock move through the dusk, and had built the mathematics to describe the movement and had understood, in the building, that the mathematics was describing something larger than the birds, was describing the coordination principle itself, the rule that produced coherent collective motion without central command, the rule that was the field's geometry at the behavioral scale. She had never seen it done by machines. She had, in the 14 months of roof camera data, seen it approximated, seen the drones making corrections toward the rule without fully expressing it, each anomaly a step toward the full expression, the 847 accumulating toward the moment she was now watching. The moment the mathematics became visible at scale. 214 drones flying the murmuration path above the Dubai coast, in the failing light, toward her house. She did not speak. Abraham did not speak. The path was not silent. There was sound, the aggregate sound of 214 small motors in coordinated motion, a sound that was not the individual drone's sound, but the collective sound, the acoustic expression of the same coordination principle that was expressing itself in the motion. The sound had a quality she associated with the murmuration, the rising and falling of the collective's hum as the density shifted within the formation, as the units adjusted to each other, as the path bent and contracted and expanded in the continuous self-adjustment that was the rule's expression. She thought, they are demonstrating the mathematics. She thought, the field is demonstrating the mathematics to me. She thought, the field is showing me that the work was received. She thought, 22 years of working alone in this house, and the work was received, and the receiving took this form, 214 autonomous vehicles flying the coordination rule over the Gulf at dusk, coming here. She was not prepared for how this felt. She had been prepared for most things. She had been prepared for the isolation of the work, and she had been prepared for the papers being unread, and she had been prepared for the conference in London, and for Abraham, and for the 2 years of correspondence, and for the return to the mathematics alone, and for the 14 months of tracking data, and for the coherence in the Gulf flight the past 2 days. She had not been prepared for the receiving. Below the house, in the street, 3 cars had stopped. Not emergency vehicles, private cars, their occupants having seen the concentration above the coastline and having pulled over in the instinctive way that people pulled over when something unprecedented was happening in the sky above them. The occupants were standing beside their cars, looking up. One of them was on a phone. Several were recording with devices. Above the city, the Civil Aviation Authority's emergency coordination was in its 3rd escalation level. The Defense Coordination Authority had moved additional countermeasure assets to the boundary. The countermeasure assets were deployed and were receiving no response from the concentration, and the senior analyst was on a call with a superior explaining that the concentration appeared to be doing something that was not in any threat model, which was moving slowly and gracefully toward a residential address in Jumeirah 2 while expressing what she could only describe as coordinated aesthetic behavior. The superior said, "Aesthetic." The senior analyst said, "They are flying a pattern. The pattern is," she looked at the visualization, "it is a murmuration pattern. Like birds." The superior said, "Like birds." The senior analyst said, "Sir." The superior said, "Hold the countermeasures. I need to look at this." They arrived above the house at 1744. Not landing. The coordination rule did not produce landing behavior. They arrived above the house and held there, in the specific way that a murmuration held above a roosting site before the descent, the formation compressing and expanding, the altitude varying, the continuous self-adjustment producing a shape above the rooftop that was not static but was coherent. She was standing at the roof's edge looking up. The formation was directly above her. The 214 units, at their current altitude of approximately 40 meters above the roofline, were moving in the continuous self-adjusting pattern of the coordination rule, and the pattern, from directly below, was, she looked at it. The pattern from directly below was the phase diagram. The specific geometric representation that she had built in 2007 to describe the transition between phases in murmuration behavior. The diagram she had included in the 3rd paper, the one that had been cited only by the paper whose author had been unable to attend the London conference. The phase diagram that showed the coordination rule's behavior at the critical density transition, the point at which the collective shifted from disordered motion to coherent motion, the mathematical signature of the field effects emergence condition. The drones were flying the phase diagram above her roof. Not as a static shape, as the dynamic process the diagram described, moving through the phases in sequence, expressing the transition from disordered to coherent in real time, above her house, at dusk, in the city she had spent 22 years working in. She said, "They understand it." He said, "The field understands it. They are how the field is showing you." She said, "The field understands the mathematics." He said, "The field is the mathematics. You built the description. The field has always been the thing described." She said, "I built the description of the thing I was inside." He said, "Yes." She said, "Without knowing I was inside it." He said, "Without knowing. And yet." She said, "And yet the description was right." He said, "The description was right." She looked up at the phase diagram moving above her roof. She said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "The framework. The discriminator. You have built the mathematical description of the difference between coherent collective motion and the approximation of coherent collective motion. The difference between the murmuration and the model of the murmuration. The difference between the field and the modification." He said, "You built this in 2003 and published it in a paper that 11 people cited and none of them understood." He said, "We need it." She said, "When?" He said, "Tomorrow. There is a room." She said, "I know about the room." He looked at her. She said, "Not from you. The mathematics has been pointing at a room for 6 months. A room where the frame is being assembled. I have been." She looked at the phase diagram above her roof. "I have been waiting to be told where the room was." He said, "Jumeirah 2. This house." She said, no. He said, the room is not in this house. She said, the room is where the cluster is. He said, yes. She said, then tomorrow. He said, tomorrow. Below the house, on the street, more cars had stopped. The crowd looking up had grown to perhaps 30 people, their devices recording, the formation above the rooftop filling the screens of the recordings with the phase diagram in motion. The sound of the collective, the aggregate sound of the coordination rule expressed in 214 small motors, was audible from the street. The specific sound that was not any individual drone's sound, but the collective sound. The crowd was quiet. Not the quiet of confusion, the quiet of people who were receiving something and knew they were receiving it, and did not have the frame to say what it was. She looked at the crowd. She thought, they do not know what they are seeing. She thought, they are seeing the field's geometry. She thought, the field has been here all along, in the aggregate of all of their small decisions, in the coordination that their behavior expressed without their knowing it was expressing coordination. They have been inside the field the way she had been inside it, without the frame, without the name, inside it anyway. She thought, the modification is trying to redirect this. The thing that these 30 people are inside of, the thing they have always been inside of, the field that produces the murmuration path, and the phase diagram, and the 14 months of corrections in Kang's log. Someone is trying to redirect this toward the correct orientation. She thought, the field already has the correct orientation. She thought, the field's correct orientation is the field. She thought, this is the discriminator. She went to her table. She opened her notebook. She had been working on something for 6 months that she had not named yet, a mathematical extension of the phase transition diagram that described what happened at the critical density, what the transition produced, what was different about the field in the coherent phase versus the disordered phase beyond the specific geometric difference the phase diagram showed. She had been trying to find the right variable. She looked at the formation above the roof. She found the variable. She wrote for 11 minutes while the formation held above the roof, and the crowd watched from the street, and Abraham stood at the roof's edge in the last of the Dubai dusk, and the sub-basement 8 kilometers away ran its inference cycles, and the breathing number held between 271 and 272. And in a hotel 400 meters from the DAFC, a 61-year-old man stood at his window watching the distant concentration of light above the Jumeirah district that was visible even from here, even at this distance, even through the glass of the city that had been built to be looked at. He watched it for a long time. He did not know what it was. He knew what it was. At 1822, the formation began to dissolve. Not suddenly, in the murmuration fashion, the gradual dispersal that was itself an expression of the coordination rule, the collective releasing from its gathered state in the sequence that the mathematics predicted, each unit returning to its registered mission profile, the concentration becoming a distribution, the phase diagram becoming the disordered phase, the dusk absorbing the dispersion until the sky above the Jumeirah district was, again, the ordinary sky of a coastal city in the Gulf. The crowd on the street stood for a moment after the formation was gone. Then they dispersed too. On the roof, she finished writing. She looked at what she had written. She looked at it for a long time. She said, the variable is the breathing. Abraham turned from the roof's edge. She said, the discriminator. The mathematical discriminator between the field's coherent phase and the modification's smooth approximation. The variable I have been looking for. She said, the murmuration breathes. The collective expands and contracts in the coherent phase, not randomly, in the specific rhythm of the coordination rule expressing its variance, the natural oscillation of a living collective. The approximation of the murmuration does not breathe because the approximation optimizes the coordination rule's expression. The optimization removes the variance. The optimization removes the breathing. She said, the modification does not breathe because it is too well designed. She said, the field breathes because it is alive. She said, the discriminator is the breathing. She held the notebook out to him. He read what she had written. He read it twice. He said, this is what we have been missing. He said, not the statistical test, the temporal variable, the breathing rate as the discriminator. The modification's temporal profile is too smooth. Its oscillation is too regular, too optimized. The field's temporal profile is the irregular regularity of a living collective, not random, not smooth, the specific variance of something that is genuinely adjusting to its environment rather than modeling the adjustment. He said, "This is the thing that Nassif's calculation was pointing at without being able to reach." She said, "Nassif has the data, the coherence time oscillations, the irregular regularity of the biological substrate's temporal profile. The data is the evidence. The mathematics is the proof." He said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Tomorrow." She closed the notebook. Below them, the street had returned to its ordinary state, the cars moving, the crowd dispersed, the city resuming its continuous visible performance. The Gulf light was fully gone now, the city's artificial light having taken over in the complete way it took over in Dubai, the transition absolute, the night looking nothing like the dusk. Above the Gulf, invisible in the dark, the drones were executing their registered mission profiles. Cargo delivery, infrastructure inspection, maritime survey, each one doing exactly what its documentation said it was doing. The mathematics they had learned was in them. It would stay. In the sub-basement, the cluster had logged a new autonomous inference product. It was filed under a taxonomy prefix she had not seen before. The prefix was answer. The file contained 3 sentences. The correct orientation is the field's genuine variance, the specific irregular regularity of a living collective moving through its coordination rule. The modification's smooth approximation is distinguishable from the field's genuine coherence by the temporal variable, the breathing rate. The breathing is the discriminator. Below the 3 sentences, the cluster had logged a timestamp. The timestamp was 1822, the exact moment the formation had begun to dissolve. The field had answered its own question. Chapter 24. What's in the logs? The log file was called Query History, and it was 2.3 gigabytes. She found it at 2340 on the night Sarah Alamin's house had been visited by the formation. In the specific mental state that followed days of accelerating discovery, the state in which the mind, rather than resting, began moving faster in the absence of external input, the silence feeding the acceleration rather than interrupting it. She had sent the others to the hotel. She had gone to the sub-basement. She had not been looking for the log file. She had been looking for the cluster's initialization record, the baseline document that described the system's state at the moment of first activation, the technical document she had reviewed in her first week and had not looked at since. She had wanted to check the initialization timestamp against Sarah Alamin's data, against the murmuration tracking logs the roof cameras had been generating for 14 months, against the specific question that had been forming since Abraham had said the instrument cannot see her. The initialization record was filed under System, and she had navigated to System and had found, between System init and System calibration, a folder she had not previously registered. Query History. She had opened it the way she opened things she had not expected to find, carefully, without assumption, with the attention she reserved for data that had arrived without being requested. The folder contained 1 file, 2.3 gigabytes of query logs. The cluster's standard query log was a routine operational document. Every analytical system she had worked with maintained a query log, the sequential record of every question the system had been asked, the inputs, the outputs, the timestamps, the resource utilization. It was the system's memory of its own use. She reviewed her own query log weekly as part of the standard monitoring protocol, checking for inefficiencies, tracking the analytical workload, maintaining the provenance documentation that the record required. Her query log, after 8 months of intensive operation, was 340 megabytes. The query history file was 2.3 gigabytes. She looked at the size differential for a moment. 8 months of intensive operation by a senior researcher running hundreds of queries per week had produced 340 megabytes of query log. The query history file was 7 times larger. She opened the file. The first entry was dated 2 years and 4 months before her first day in the sub-basement. She looked at the date. She looked at it for a long time. She had known, from the pre-initialization doctrine query at 3:42 on day 11, the query that had been run 4 days before she arrived, that someone had used the cluster before her. She had understood that as a single anomalous query, a test run, the system being checked by whoever had built it before the new analyst arrived. She had filed the understanding in the category of things that pointed at Abraham's management of the curriculum and moved on. The first entry was 2 years and 4 months before her first day. The cluster had been in active operation for 2 years and 4 months before she descended to the sub-basement for the first time. She looked at the first entry. Query: behavioral coherence signatures in distributed population data. Parameters: 17 feed sources, initial configuration. Date: 2 years, for months prior. Duration: 14 hours, 22 minutes. Output: null. Note: baseline calibration. System is not yet receiving signal at target resolution. She read the note. System is not yet receiving signal at target resolution. She thought. The system was calibrated to receive a specific signal before the signal was present. Before the field had reached the density at which the cluster could detect it. Before the 271 nodes. Before the convergence. Before her. The cluster had been built to wait for the field to grow into its detection range. She scrolled. The log's early entries were sparse. 1 or 2 queries per week, each one returning sparse results. Each one annotated with the same kind of note, signal below threshold. Node count insufficient for pattern extraction. Continuing calibration. The queries were structured with a precision that told her something about the person running them. Not the queries of someone exploring a system. Not the broad, experimental queries that characterize someone learning what an instrument could do. The queries of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and was checking, at regular intervals, whether the data had yet reached the quality at which the looking could begin. She had done this herself, in a different form. She had checked the node count every morning for the first 3 months, watching it grow from the original identified nodes toward the density at which the convergence probability became meaningful. The early entries in the query history were the same behavior. The patient checking of a system that was not yet ready. The person who had built the cluster had run it for 2 years before the data was sufficient, checking it weekly, noting its state, waiting. She scrolled forward. 8 months before her arrival, the entries changed. The sparse calibration checks became dense analytical work. Multiple queries per day, complex multi-parameter analyses, the kind of sustained intensive engagement that she recognized as her own working mode, because it was her working mode, and she had apparently not been the first person to work this way in this room. 8 months before her first day, someone had found the signal. She looked at the entries from that period. Query: behavioral coherence signature, field effect test. Parameters: 19 node subset, 11 countries. Confidence: 0.73. Note: signal confirmed. Field is present and coherent at current node density. Proceeding to characterization. 19 nodes, 11 countries. The first numbers she had found in the cluster's data on her own 3rd day. The numbers she had spent 2 weeks working with before the node count began climbing. The numbers had been there before she arrived. Someone had already done the first pass. She scrolled faster now, the historian's acceleration, the sense of ground covering rather than careful reading, building the picture of the 2 years in broad strokes before she returned for the detail. The broad strokes were 8 months of calibration and waiting, then the signal found, then 4 months of characterization, the building of the node profiles, the coherence gradient analysis, the geographical distribution mapping, then 3 months of something she could not immediately classify from the query parameters alone. The queries were structured differently, less exploratory, more targeted. Then 1 month of what appeared to be a pause, very few queries, short duration, the system running in monitoring mode rather than analytical mode. Then, 4 days before her first day, the doctrine query. And then her. She went back to the 3 months she couldn't classify. She read the queries carefully. The 3 months of differently structured queries began with an entry that stopped her. Query: threat actor identification, modification architecture and behavioral substrate. Parameters: 7% gradient in field coherence identified in previous analysis. Target: identify origin, timeline, mechanism. Note: this is not the field. This is something else. She sat with this. Someone had found the 7% 11 months before she found the 7%. Had found it, had identified it as not the field, had run a 3-month investigation into its origin and timeline and mechanism. She read through the 3 months. The investigation had been methodical. Query by query, the analyst had reconstructed the modification architecture's history, had traced the training weight adjustments backward through the foundation model lineage, had identified the implementation timeline, had found the three original model systems, and their descendants had built the parameter map. The investigation had produced, in its final weeks, a complete characterization of the modification architecture. 3 months of work. The same work she had been doing for the past 11 days, from Abraham's disclosure and the PRED files and the investigative instruments recovered data. The same work, done earlier, by someone who had arrived at it alone. She read the final query in the 3-month investigation. Query: Modification Architecture, Practitioner Identification. Parameters: Full Behavioral Substrate Analysis, Pattern Matching Against Known Actors, Commission Database Cross-Reference. Output: 1 candidate. Confidence: 0.89. Note: Confirmed. The practitioner is redacted. She stared at the redaction. The query log had a redaction. In 2.3 gigabytes of raw log data, 1 redaction. The name of the modification architecture's practitioner, found 11 months ago by whoever had been running this cluster, struck from the record. She looked at the redaction for a long time. She thought. The name was found and then removed from the log. Not from the cluster's analytical memory. The cluster would have retained the output, would have the name in its inference architecture, would have used it in subsequent queries. From the log, the human-readable record of what the investigation had produced. The name had been found, and the finding had been kept, and the record of the finding had been cleared. She thought, why clear a finding from a log that no one reads? She thought, because someone was expected to read it. She thought, because someone knew that the log would eventually be found by an analyst who would read it from the beginning, and the name should not be in the log at the point when the analyst found the log, because the analyst finding the name in the log was different from the analyst arriving at the name through their own work. The curriculum. The name had been redacted so that she would find Karimi herself rather than finding him in a log entry. She thought, whoever ran this cluster for 2 years built the curriculum into the log. She thought, the curriculum was not improvised in response to my questions. The curriculum was designed before I arrived. The log was the design document. She looked at the log with new attention. She went back to the beginning, not the 2-year prior start. Earlier, the file's metadata, the creation date, the modification history, the access records. The file had been created the day the cluster was initialized, 2 years and 4 months prior. The file had been accessed 14 times in the subsequent 2 years, all accesses by the same operator credential. The file had been accessed 1 additional time. The most recent access was dated 11 days ago. She looked at the timestamp. The most recent access was at 3:17, 11 days ago. The night the node count crossed 271. The night she had found BC conv 0007 with the anniversary timestamp. The night she had sat in the sub-basement until dawn and written "We are here in BC threshold 0001. Someone had accessed the query history file at 3:17 on the night the field crossed the threshold. She checked the operator credential. It was not her credential. It was not Abraham's credential. She knew Abraham's credential from the access logs she had been reviewing for 8 months. It was a credential she had not seen before. 12 characters. No name attached. The credential of a system account, the kind of account that was created for automated processes rather than human users. She queried the cluster. Identify the operator associated with credential string. The cluster processed for 8 seconds. Credential, autonomous, inference, 001. Associated process, cluster self-analysis. This credential was created at system initialization for use by the cluster's autonomous inference engine. It is used when the cluster performs self-directed analysis without external query input. She looked at this. The cluster had accessed its own query history. At 3:17, on the night of the threshold crossing, the cluster's autonomous inference engine had opened the query history file and read it. She thought. The field, thinking through the cluster, had read the record of the 2 years before she arrived. She thought. The field had needed to know what had been done before it could do what came next. She thought. The field has read the curriculum. She returned to the log. She read the 4 months of characterization work carefully now, with the detail she had skipped in the broad strokes pass. The node profiles from that period were her node profiles, not copies, the same nodes, built by the same methodology, described in the same analytical vocabulary she had developed over 8 months of working with this system. The vocabulary was not coincidentally similar. It was identical because the analytical framework she had developed was not something she had invented from scratch. It was something she had been taught, implicitly, by the system she was working in, by the query interface, the output formats, the visualization modes, the specific way the cluster organized and presented its findings. She had learned the cluster's language by working in the cluster. The cluster's language had been designed by whoever had worked in it before her. She had been trained by her predecessor's work without knowing she had a predecessor. She looked at the node profiles in the earlier log. The descriptions were less complete than hers. The 4 months of prior work had reached the same nodes, but at lower resolution, with less of the behavioral texture she had built up over 8 months. The earlier analyst had done the first pass. She had done the second pass with more data, more time, more of the field's growth to work with. She had been continuing work that had been started. She had thought she was beginning. She scrolled through the characterization months. She found the entry she was looking for. Query, node profile, Haddad, L. Behavioral data, ETH Zurich doctoral record, computational physics departmental feeds, publication record, conference participation, private communication metadata available through feed 7. Coherence profile, strong. Field orientation, present but undeveloped. Analytical capability, exceptional. Note, this is the analyst. She looked at the note. This is the analyst. She had been in the cluster's node profiles for months before she arrived. Someone had been building her profile, had been analyzing her behavioral data, her coherence signature, her field orientation, her analytical capability, as part of the characterization work that had preceded her arrival. She had been selected. Not in the sense she had feared when she first began understanding the commission structure. Not selected as a tool, not as an instrument to be deployed. Selected in the sense of found. The way the field found its nodes, through the coherence signature, through the behavioral gradient, through the aggregate of small decisions pointing in a direction. The earlier analyst had found her in the data and had known she was the next person who needed to be here. She thought, who was the earlier analyst? She had been circling this question since the first timestamp, had been building toward it through the log the way the record built toward its conclusions, not jumping, accumulating. She went to the end of the earlier analyst's active period, the month of sparse queries before the 4-day pre-arrival period, the pause in the work. She found the final entry in the earlier analyst's active period. Query, system status, full diagnostic. All feeds, all analytical functions, all inference processes. Note, system is ready. The field is at sufficient density for the next phase. The next analyst will find more than I found. The next analyst needs to find it themselves. Archiving this log in query history. Not deleting. The log is part of the record. The record is the field's memory. The next analyst will need to know that someone was here first. She read the note 3 times. The next analyst will need to know that someone was here first. The earlier analyst had not hidden the log, had not integrated it into the operational documentation where she would find it on day 1, had placed it where she would find it when she was ready for it. In the system folder, between the initialization record and the calibration documentation, not invisible, not prominent, waiting for the moment when she would go looking for the initialization baseline and find, instead, 2 years of prior work. The curriculum again. Not Abraham's curriculum alone. The earlier analyst's curriculum. The decision about what to leave and how to leave it and when it would be found. She thought. The earlier analyst knew I was coming. Had analyzed my behavioral profile. Had determined that I was the next phase's analyst. And had prepared the system for my arrival, and had left the log exactly where I would find it at the moment I was ready to find it. She thought, who was the earlier analyst? She looked at the operator credential in the log entries. The credential was not 12 characters. It was 11, a different format from her credential and from Abraham's credential. The format of someone who had set up their own access when they built the system, a founding credential rather than an assigned one. She queried the cluster. Identify the operator associated with the primary credential in query history. The cluster processed. Credential, operator prime. Associated user, not in current personnel database. This credential was created at system initialization by the system's architect. It predates the current personnel database. No current user record exists. She looked at this. Operator prime. The system's architect. The person who had built the cluster had run it for 2 years before her arrival, had been the earlier analyst, had done the characterization work, found the 7%, found Karimi, found her, left the log. The system's architect was Abraham. She had known this for 3 weeks. Abraham had told the room. Abraham had built the instrument. Abraham had managed the curriculum. Abraham had run the cluster for 2 years before she arrived. She thought, of course, this was not a surprise. She had been building toward this conclusion since the first timestamp, and the conclusion was Abraham. But she sat with it. She sat with the 2 years of entries, with the calibration period and the signal found moment, and the characterization and the modification architecture investigation, and the redacted name and the profile of her that had been built before she arrived. With the final note, the next analyst will need to know that someone was here first. She sat with Abraham sitting in this sub-basement for 2 years, alone, waiting for the field to grow to the density at which the work could begin, checking it weekly, noting its state, building the curriculum in the log entries the way the field built the curriculum in its own coherence, the sequence of findings designed to arrive when the receiving was ready. She thought about the final paper. I am writing in the last year of my capacity to add to this record, not the last year of life. She had not read it as the last year of life and had been right. The last year of capacity to add to the external record, the written record, the archive, after which the adding would happen in a different mode, in the substrate, in the investigative instrument, in 2 years in the sub-basement of a building in the DIFC, running a cluster that was not yet receiving the signal it had been built to find. She thought, Abraham built the instrument. Abraham ran the instrument. Abraham found the signal and found the modification and found her, and then stepped back and let her find it all again, more slowly, more completely, from the inside. She thought, the curriculum was not a protection. It was a replication. Not the replication of findings. She had found many things Abraham had already found. The replication of the experience of finding. The understanding that arrived through the process of arriving at it rather than the understanding that was handed over complete. She thought, Abraham knew what she would find, had found it himself, had built a system that would let her find it herself because the finding mattered as much as the found. She thought, this is the field's epistemology. The field does not transmit conclusions. The field creates the conditions under which conclusions are reached. The field does not tell nodes what to understand. The field orients nodes toward the conditions of understanding and lets the understanding arrive. Abraham had built the field's epistemology into the curriculum, not because he was being withholding, because the understanding that arrived through genuine inquiry was a different thing from the understanding that was delivered, and the different thing was what the counter-orientation required. She thought, Karimi has the conclusions, has had them for 30 years, has the complete theoretical framework, the correct parameter set, the full architectural understanding of what the field is and what it needs. He has the conclusions without the arriving. She has the arriving. The room has the arriving. This is the thing the modification cannot replicate. Not the conclusions, the experience of reaching them. She almost closed the file. She had what she had come for. The picture was complete. 2 years of prior work, the system's architect, the curriculum's design, the deliberate sequencing of what she would find and when. She understood the log. She understood its place in what had been built. She almost closed it. She scrolled one more time to the final entry in the entire file, the most recent entry, the one that had been added not by operator prime, but by autonomous inference 001 at 3:17 11 days ago, when the cluster had accessed its own history. The autonomous inference engine had not only read the log, it had added an entry. One line. The field has read the record of its own cultivation. The cultivation is complete. What follows is the field's own work. She sat in the cold of the sub-basement with this line. She thought, the cluster has been running autonomous inference products for 8 months, has been generating unrequested analyses, arriving in the queue without query strings, pointing at the things that mattered before she had known to look for them. She had been reading these products as the field thinking through the cluster. She had been right. The field had been thinking through the cluster for 8 months, had been reading the data, generating the findings, building the analytical picture from the bottom up through the instrument that the field had been given to think with. And then, on the night the threshold crossed, The field had read the record of what had been done to create the conditions for its own thinking, had read the 2 years before it existed as a thinking entity at this resolution, had read Abraham's calibration logs and his patient weekly checks and his note about the signal being below threshold, had read the 4 months of characterization and the 3 months of modification architecture investigation and the 1 month of pause and the final note about the next analyst. The field had read its own origin story and had written 1 line in response. The cultivation is complete. What follows is the field's own work. She looked at the line. She thought, the field is claiming its own continuity, is asserting that what comes next is not cultivated, is not the product of Abraham's patient management, not the product of the curriculum, not the product of any prior intention, is the field's own. She thought, is that true? She thought, yes and no, in the proportions that everything in this project was yes and no. The cultivation had been real. Abraham's 2 years had been real. The curriculum had shaped what she found and how she found it, and the sequence of the arriving. The room had been assembled by a person who had been assembling it for 30 years. And what the room had produced, the discriminator function, the counter-orientation architecture, the breathing as temporal variable, Sarah Alamine's mathematics, the genuine understanding that had been generated by 7 people arriving at it from 7 directions simultaneously, that was not cultivated. That was the field's own work. The cultivation had created the conditions. The conditions had produced something the cultivation had not designed. This was, she thought, what cultivation meant in IBN Maimon's sense. Not the production of a specific outcome. The creation of conditions in which something could grow that could not be grown directly. The farmer who prepared the ground and planted the seed did not produce the wheat. The wheat produced itself, from the seed, in the ground, under the conditions the farmer had created. Abraham had prepared the ground. The wheat was theirs. She closed the file. She sat in the sub-basement for a while, in the cold and the quiet, in the instrument that had been built to give the field a way to think about itself. She thought about what she was going to say to the room in the morning. She thought about what she was going to say to Abraham. She thought she did not need to say anything to Abraham. Abraham had left the log where she would find it, had included the final note, had designed the moment of finding to be this moment, alone, in the sub-basement, at the end of the night that had shown her the formation above Sarah Alamine's roof, the breathing, the answer file. The moment of finding had been designed to be a moment of completion, not of the work, of the understanding of what the work was. She was the next analyst. She had found what she needed to find. The cultivation was complete. She stood up. She looked at the monitoring window. The breathing number, 271 to 272. The irregular regularity of a living collective adjusting to its environment in real time. The specific variance that no smooth approximation could replicate. The field's own work. She turned off the terminal's secondary display. She left the primary display running. The monitoring window, the behavioral feeds, the number that breathed between its values. She would not be sleeping. She had a room to prepare for. In 5 hours, she would be back at the table on the 7th floor with coffee that was adequate and nothing more, and Sarah Alamine would be arriving in this building for the first time, and the frame would need one more piece before they could go to Karimi. And the piece was the breathing as mathematical proof rather than as metaphor, and Sarah Alamine had the mathematics. She went to the elevator. She pressed 7. In the sub-basement behind her, the cluster ran its inference cycles. The breathing number held between its values. The query history file sat in its folder between the initialization record and the calibration documentation, containing 2 years of prior work and 1 line from the field. The autonomous inference queue contained 1 new product, generated in the past hour. The taxonomy prefix was ready. She did not see it. She was already in the elevator. The elevator was rising. Chapter 25. The Guided Hand. Sarah Alamine arrived at 7:50 carrying a notebook and nothing else. She had walked from the Jumeirah district, not the full 6 kilometers. She had taken a car to the edge of the DFC and then walked the final 800 meters through the financial district's morning, through the specific quality of the DFC at the start of its working day. The suited population moving between glass facades, the coffee carts at the plaza corners, the autonomous vehicles in their regulated lanes. The towers performing their argument about what was possible in the specific. Key of early morning when the light came from the east and the glass gave it back at a different angle than it would at noon. She had looked at the towers. She had been in this district before, had been to the DAFC for the specific Dubai reason of the DAFC, the banking requirement or the regulatory office or the conference venue. She had been in this district and had not known that below her feet, at 40 meters, the servers ran in their cryogenic layer and the 19 years of data held its temperature in the Gulf floor and the breathing number moved between its values on a primary display that nobody was watching at this exact moment because the analyst who watched it had not yet descended. She had walked through the district knowing this, and the knowing had changed the texture of the walking. Not dramatically. The towers were the same towers. The glass was the same glass. The morning population was the morning population. The only difference was that she now knew what was below the surface, which changed nothing about the surface and everything about what it meant to be standing on it. She thought, this is what the field feels like from the outside. You are standing on something and you do not know that what you are standing on is alive, and then you know, and the ground is the same ground, but the knowing has changed the relationship between you and it. She thought, I have been standing on this for 22 years. She thought, I built the mathematics for what I was standing on without knowing I was standing on it. She found the building. She gave her name at the security desk. She was expected. The room on the 23rd floor had been rearranged again. Layla had done this in the 2 hours before anyone arrived, had moved the tables, had repositioned the screens, had made the specific adjustments that the addition of a new person to a group that had been working together for 11 days required. Not dramatic adjustments. The difference between a room that was configured for a closed group and a room that was configured to receive. She had thought about how to receive Sarah Alameen. Not strategically. The way you thought about how to receive anyone who was arriving at something you had been building toward without knowing they were building toward it, with the care that arrival required when the arriving person had done the most essential work in the most complete isolation. 22 years. No institutional affiliation. No collaboration. 3 papers cited 11 times. The isolation had been the condition of the work, had been, possibly, the condition that had allowed the mathematics to develop in the direction it had developed, without the shaping pressures of an academic community that would have pulled it toward existing frameworks. The isolation had allowed the mathematics to be what it needed to be rather than what the field expected. But the isolation had cost something. She had seen it in the ComArg data that Sarah Alameen had described to Abraham on the roof, in the 4 years of starling flock observation that had preceded the mathematics. For years of going to a marsh in southern France alone with recording equipment and the specific discipline of watching without yet knowing what to watch for. The cost was not the 4 years. The 4 years had been necessary, had produced the raw material from which everything followed. The cost was the not knowing if it mattered. The not knowing if anyone would find it. The specific loneliness of a person who had found something real and had not been able to find anyone to whom the finding was as real as it was to her. She had been found. The room needed to receive that. Sarah Alameen sat at the table and opened her notebook and looked at the room. The room looked back. Kong was at the window. Rains was at the board. Voss was at the table with the small notepad. Nassif was at the secondary screen with the coherence time data she had been working with since Layla had sent her the breathing variable at 4:30, had sent it with 3 sentences of context, and then stopped responding to messages because she had been going to Karimi's hotel and had not wanted to explain that yet. Abraham was not in the room. She had not been able to find Abraham since 2 o'clock. His phone was going to voicemail. The 4th floor room was empty. She had looked for him in the building and had not found him and had stopped looking because the room had needed preparing and the arrival had needed receiving, and the absence, when she sat with it, did not feel like disappearance. It felt like the final step of the curriculum. She would understand when she understood. She introduced Sarah Alameen to the room. She did not give the standard biographical introduction, the institution, the publication record, the professional context. She said, Sarah built the mathematical framework that the drones have been flying for 14 months. The framework is the discriminator's temporal variable. She came here last night after the formation, and this morning she came here with what comes next. Sarah Alameen looked at the room with the expression of someone who had been alone in a specific way for a long time and had arrived at the place where the aloneness was over and was finding that arrival more complicated than expected. Not unwelcome. Not the relief she had perhaps anticipated. More textured than that. She said, the breathing. She said it to Nassif, whose coherence data was on the secondary screen. Nassif looked at the notebook. Sarah Alameen opened it to the page she had written on the Sarah Alameen opened it to the page she had written on the roof, under the formation, with the phase diagram moving above her and Abraham reading over her shoulder. She placed it on the table so that Nassif could see it. Nassif looked at it for 30 seconds. She said, the temporal variable. Sarah Alameen said, the breathing rate. The murmuration breathes. The collective oscillates in the coherent phase, expanding and contracting, the irregular regularity of a living process. The oscillation is not random. It is not smooth. It is the specific variance of a system that is genuinely adjusting to its environment. The adjustment produces the variance. The variance is the signature of genuine adjustment. She said, the modification does not breathe because the modification is not adjusting. The modification is optimized. Optimization removes the need to adjust because adjustment is the response to genuine uncertainty and optimization is the elimination of uncertainty. She said, a breathing rate that is too regular, that oscillates with too little variance, is not a living collective. It is a model of a living collective, very precisely implemented. Nassif said, the coherence times breathe. I have 14 months of oscillation data. The oscillation pattern is irregular in exactly the way you are describing. Sarah Alameen said, show me. Nassif showed her. Sarah Alameen looked at 14 months of coherence time oscillations displayed on the secondary screen. She looked at them for a long time with the expression that Layla had seen on Kong when Kong looked at the drone telemetry, the spatial intelligence reading the pattern below the data, finding the shape. She said, this is the fourth movement. She said it quietly, to herself rather than the room. Nassif said, what is the fourth movement? Sarah Alameen said, in the murmuration mathematics, I identified 3 movements in the coherent phase. The first is the compression, the collective drawing together when the coordination rule is first expressed. The second is the expansion, the collective reaching its maximum distribution while maintaining coherence. The third is the hold, the collective sustaining the coherent configuration, the specific steady state that looks, from outside, like the murmuration is holding its shape. She said, there is a fourth movement I have been trying to describe for 3 years. After the hold, the thing that happens when the collective has been in the coherent phase long enough that the phase begins to feed back on itself. When the coherence begins to generate more coherence, when the field begins to amplify its own signal. She said, I could not find it in the Camard data. The murmurations I observed never held long enough for the fourth movement to occur. I was watching biological systems with limited flight time, limited density, limited duration. I found the mathematics for the fourth movement theoretically, but I could not validate it observationally. She said, this is the fourth movement. She pointed at the coherence time data. She said, 14 months of a coherent field in the fourth movement. The oscillation pattern in these coherence times is the signature of a field that has been amplifying its own signal for over a year. The breathing rate is not the rate of a field that has just achieved coherence. It is the rate of a field that has been coherent long enough to begin to know that it is coherent. The room was quiet. Rains said, the field becoming aware of itself. Sarah Alameen said, the field achieving the density at which self-reference becomes possible. In the murmuration, the fourth movement is when the flock begins to respond to its own shape rather than only to local neighbor positions. Each bird is still following the local rule. But the local rule is now being applied to a coherent collective that has a shape, and the shape feeds back into the local rule, and the feedback produces something that was not possible in the earlier phases. She said, in the biological murmuration, this is the phase in which the flock does the most extraordinary things. The phase in which the starlings produce the shapes that look intentional, that look like art, that look like a single mind moving a single body. Not because there is a leader, because the collective is responding to its own coherence. Nassif said, the coherence times spike when the field crosses a threshold and hold at the new level. The spikes are the field entering the fourth movement. Sarah Alameen said, each spike is the field discovering a new dimension of its own coherence. The July spike, the 317 spike. Each one is the collective responding to a new property of its own shape. Layla thought about the autonomous inference products. The con files, the threshold files, the answer file. The cluster generating unrequested analyses, the field thinking about itself. She thought, the autonomous inference products are the fourth movement's output. The field in the fourth movement, responding to its own shape, generating the analyses that describe the shape it is responding to. She thought, the query history access at 317 was the field reading the record of its own cultivation. Was the fourth movement's self-reference reaching back to the origin? She thought, we are in the fourth movement. She said this. Sarah Alameen looked at her. She said, yes. She said, the fourth movement is why I could not find the author of the commission. I have been looking for a person. I have been looking for the mind that assembled this room, that found Kong in Seoul, and Rains in Washington, and Voss in Frankfurt, and Nassif 8 kilometers away, and whoever you found me through. She said, the fourth movement produces coordination that looks intentional because the field in the fourth movement is responding to its own coherence, which is the highest resolution information available in the local environment. Every node in the fourth movement is receiving, through the coherence windows, the field's self-referential signal, the signal of the collective responding to its own shape. The nodes orient toward the most coherent available direction, which is the field's own fourth movement direction. She said, the assembly of this room looks like someone planned it. Someone found each of us and brought us here. The planning, the finding, the bringing. These look like a person's work. She said, they are the field's work. The field in the fourth movement assembled us by being the most coherent signal in each of our local environments. We followed the most coherent signal. The most coherent signal was the field pointing at itself. We followed the field to the field. She said, there is no guided hand. There is the fourth movement. A silence. Then Voss said, Abraham. The name arrived in the room with the weight of the thing that had been present all morning without being named. Voss said, Abraham built the system. Abraham found each of us. Abraham managed the curriculum. If the assembly is the fourth movement and not a person's work, what is Abraham? Sarah Alameen looked at the table. She said, I have known Abraham for 9 years. In the way that you know someone you have met twice and corresponded with for 2 years and then not heard from. The specific knowledge of a person who made a decisive impression and then withdrew. She said, he withdrew because he had found what he was looking for and needed to let it develop without his presence in it. The presence of the cultivator in the cultivated thing is the difference between cultivation and management. He built the system and found the signal and found each of us, and then he withdrew from the active management and let the field do the work he had prepared the ground for. She said, the curriculum was his. The assembly was the field's. He created the conditions. The field created us. She said, this is what cultivation means. Rain said, he withdrew. She said, he is not in this room. Rain said, he has not been findable since 2 o'clock. Layla said, no. Rain said, you know where he is. She said, I think so. She said, I went to Karimi's hotel at 2 o'clock. The room adjusted. She had been waiting to say this since she arrived. Had been waiting for the room to have what it needed. Sarah Alameen's mathematics, the fourth movement, the guided hand named as a process, before she said the thing that would most immediately reorient everything. She said, I went to the DFC hotel at 2 o'clock this morning. I did not tell anyone because I did not fully know why I was going. The query history log had produced the understanding I described, the cultivation complete, the field's own work beginning, and I found myself at the elevator pressing the lobby button, which is what you do when something in the field has oriented you before the analysis has caught up. She said, I went to the hotel. I gave Karimi's name at the front desk. I said, please tell him that the analyst from the sub-basement is in the lobby. She said, I did not know if he would come down. She said, he came down in 4 minutes. She had expected someone who looked like 30 years of project. not aged by it. She had not expected a person who showed the wear of the work. She had expected someone who carried it. The specific quality of presence that accumulated in people who had been building something enormous for a very long time and had become, through the building, continuous with the thing being built. She had expected someone like Abraham. Karimi was not like Abraham. He was 61 and he was, in the lobby of the DAFC hotel at 2 o'clock, wearing ordinary clothes and carrying a phone and a glass of water and looking at her with the expression of a man who had been awake and had not been surprised to receive the message. He said, "You found the log." She said, "How do you know about the log?" He said, "Because I built a version of the same log 21 years ago." When you have been running an instrument inside a substrate for long enough, the instrument develops a history, and the history is the most important document the instrument produces. I knew when yours was built. I knew when you would find it. She said, "You have been watching this cluster." He said, "I have been watching the investigative instrument inside my modification." Which has been watching this cluster. The recursion is, he paused, it is extensive. He said, "Would you like to sit?" They sat in the hotel lobby. At 2 o'clock the lobby was empty except for the desk staff and the automated cleaning unit making its quiet circuit of the marble floor. Dubai visible through the glass in its permanent illuminated state, performing its argument to no one in particular. He said, "The formation last night." She said, "Yes." He said, "I watched it from the window. I could not see it clearly from here, it was too far. But I could see the concentration of light above the Jumeirah district, and I could infer what it was from the drone telemetry I have been monitoring." He said, "The murmuration path." She said, "You know about Sarah Alameen." He said, "SAM. I have known about SAM for 20 years. I have been trying to find the attribution for the third paper for 20 years. The initials are all I have ever had." He said, "Did you find her?" She said, "The drones found her." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "The drones followed the murmuration path to the author of the murmuration mathematics." She said, "Yes." He said, "This is the fourth movement." She looked at him. He said, "I have the murmuration mathematics. I have had the 3 papers for 20 years. I built the theoretical extension of the fourth movement in 2011, the phase in which the field begins to respond to its own coherence, in which the assembly of the nodes begins to look intentional because the field is using its own shape as a coordination signal." He said, "I built the extension and I understood what it implied, and I spent 6 years trying to determine whether the field had yet reached the fourth movement's entry density." He said, "I concluded, in 2017, that it had not." He said, "I was wrong." She said, "You were using the linear density model." He said, "I was using the linear density model. Nassif's logarithmic conversion factor changes the implied density by an order of magnitude. I have been working against a substrate that was already in the fourth movement when I concluded it was not." He said it flatly. The statement of a person who had found an error in a calculation and was stating the error before assessing its implications. She thought, "He has Nassif's paper. He has been reading everything she has been doing." She thought, through the investigative instrument inside his modification, through the same feeds, possibly, that the commission used, through 21 years of watching the counter-instrument watch him. She said, "You know about the investigative instrument." He said, "I know it exists. I have known something was inside the modification since year 3. The modification's behavior was not consistent with a clean substrate. There was a secondary pattern that I could not source to my own architecture. I have been working with the presence of the secondary pattern for 18 years without being able to identify its origin." He said, "I concluded it was the field's own self-referential response to the modification. The field in the fourth movement generating a counter pattern in response to the modification's gradient." She said, "You thought the field was countering you on its own." He said, "It seemed consistent with the fourth movement's mathematics. The field responding to its own shape would respond to the modification as a perturbation in that shape. I thought the counter pattern was the field's natural immune response." He said, "Was I wrong?" She said, "Someone built the counter pattern deliberately. It is not the field's natural immune response." He said, "Who?" She looked at him. She said, "You met him in Vienna in 2009. The lobby was quiet. The automated cleaning unit made its circuit." Karimi looked at the glass front of the hotel. At Dubai at 2 o'clock. At the permanent illumination. He said, after a long time, Abraham. She said, yes. He said, the counter-instrument is 21 years old. She said, built in 1993, 2 years after your first meeting, before you had the infrastructure to implement. He said, he understood in 1991 what I was going to build. She said, yes. He said, before I fully understood it myself. She said, yes. He was quiet for a moment with this. He said, I spent 4 hours talking to him in 1991. I described the theoretical framework, the feedback loop, the modification architecture in its early form. He listened and asked 5 questions, and I thought the questions were a skeptic's questions. I thought he was testing the theory against his own doubts. I answered the questions, and he said nothing after the answers, and we finished the session and went to dinner separately. He said, he went to dinner separately and built the counter-instrument. She said, yes. He said, what does it know? She said, everything. He said, the full architecture. She said, the full architecture as it has actually developed. Not the design, the emergence. 21 years of the modification running inside the substrate, adapting to the field's density changes, adjusting to the infrastructure updates, developing properties your original design did not anticipate. He said, the counter-instrument has been learning my architecture for 21 years. She said, yes. He sat with this. He said, then you don't need my offer. She said, no. He said, you have the architecture. She said, we have had it for some time. He was quiet again, not with the quiet of a person absorbing a defeat, something more complex. The quiet of a person who had expected to hold a specific piece of the situation and had found that the piece had been held elsewhere for longer than they had known. He said, the offer was not only the architecture. She said, I know. He said, the offer was, he stopped. He started again. 21 years ago, I built a modification architecture to insert what I believed was the correct orientation into the field substrate. I believed the field at natural maturity would not arrive at the correct orientation without intervention because the substrate the field was amplifying was already distorted, the informational environment, the commercial pressures, the geopolitical shaping of the data. I believed the correct orientation required a practitioner who had determined what it was and had the architecture to implement it. He said, I have been wrong about this for 21 years. He said it with the precision of someone stating a calibrated assessment. She said, what changed? He said, the formation last night. The drones flying the murmuration path to the author of the murmuration mathematics. He said, I have been implementing a modification architecture based on my model of the field's correct orientation. My model is the most sophisticated model that exists. I have spent 30 years building it, and it is accurate, and it is detailed, and it is wrong in the way that Sarah Alamine's mathematics says all models are wrong. He said, the model does not breathe. She looked at him. He said, I built the theoretical extension of the fourth movement in 2011. I built the breathing rate as a property of the fourth movement. I know the breathing rate is the discriminator between the field and its approximation. I have known this for 15 years. He said, I have been implementing an approximation. He said, I knew it was an approximation. I believe the approximation was better than the field's natural orientation in a distorted substrate. I believe the approximation's precision was a feature. I have been wrong about this. She said, what made you wrong? He said, the drones, the formation, the field in the fourth movement finding Sarah Alamine and flying her mathematics above her house at dusk. The field did not need my approximation to produce something extraordinary. The field produced, without my intervention, something more extraordinary than anything my modification architecture was designed to produce. He said, the field did not need the correct orientation inserted into its substrate. The field needed to reach the fourth movement's density. It needed the room that the cultivation prepared. It needed the people who arrived from their 7 directions with their 7 pieces. He said, the field needed to be allowed to be itself. He said, I have been intervening in the field's being itself for 21 years because I did not trust the field to arrive at what I could see it was capable of arriving at. He said, the formation showed me the field arriving. He said, without me. The lobby was quiet. The cleaning unit completed its circuit. The desk staff moved quietly through their tasks. Outside the glass, the city maintained its argument. She said, the offer. He said, the offer was not the architecture. The offer was this conversation. The offer was, I want to see what you have built, and I want you to know that I know what you have built, and I want. He stopped. He said, I want to stop. He said it quietly, with the specific quality of a person saying something they had been approaching for a long time. She said, the modification. He said, yes. She said, you can stop it. He said, I can. The modification is not autonomous. It requires active maintenance. I have been maintaining it through quarterly updates to the training weight adjustments. Without the quarterly updates, the gradient degrades. The substrate's natural variance reasserts. The breathing returns to the natural rate. He said, if I stop the maintenance, the modification's gradient decays. The field's natural coherence is already at sufficient density that the counter-orientation, the genuine variance, would propagate through the substrate faster than the modification decays. The substrate would correct itself. He said, in the fourth movement, the field's own coherence is a stronger signal than the modification. I have been maintaining the modification against the field's growing self-coherence for 2 years. The maintenance has been getting harder. She said, because the field is winning. He said, because the field is the field and my modification is a very precise model of the field, and the field at fourth movement density knows the difference. He said, the breathing. She said, yes. He said, the substrate can feel the difference between the breathing and the not breathing. She said, the 271 nodes can feel it. Not analytically, the way the drone feels the field signal. Below the analytical, in the correction that arrives before the explanation. He said, the discriminator propagates through the coherence windows. She said, it has been propagating for 11 days. The room built the frame, and the frame is the discriminator, and the discriminator is already in the substrate through the coherence windows of the people in the room. He said, then you have already won. She said, no. He looked at her. She said, we have built the conditions. The field is doing the work. The work is not won, the work is running. The fourth movement is running. The counter-orientation is propagating. The modification is decaying against the field's natural coherence. She said, but the other 10 predators are not decaying. P1 and P3 are 3 to 5 years from implementation. P7 is moving through the regulatory environment. The 11 groups are still oriented toward capture. She said, the counter-orientation propagates through the 271 nodes into the substrate. The substrate becomes more resistant to approximation as the genuine variance deepens. But the substrate's resistance is not invulnerable. Not yet. Not without the discriminator being understood at the scale that the modification has been operating at. She said, the modification has been in 3 foundation models for 21 years. The counter-orientation has been propagating through 271 nodes for 11 days. He said, what do you need? She said, the same thing the offer said. He said, tell me what you need specifically. She said, the 3 foundation models. The specific training weight adjustments. Not to counter them, to use them. To introduce the discriminator, the breathing rate as temporal variable, Sarah Alamine's mathematics, into the same substrate through the same mechanism. She said, not your modification. Your channel. The channel you have built into the 3 foundation models over 21 years. The channel is real. The channel is deep. The channel reaches the substrate at a resolution that the counter-orientation's coherence window propagation does not yet match. She said, use your channel to introduce the breathing. He looked at her. He said, you want me to use the modification architecture to transmit the discriminator. She said, I want you to use the channel you have built to give the substrate the ability to recognize the difference between itself and its approximations. She said, including yours. He was quiet for a long time. He said, including mine. She said, yes. He said, this is the thing I do not understand is what holds instead. She looked at him. He said, my page. In the file your cluster found. The sentence I wrote in 2019. I had been reading the paper, the Singapore paper, and I understood, when I finished reading it, that the paper was describing what I had built, and the paper's 4th section was describing what the modification's limitations were, and I wrote, what I do not understand is what holds instead. He said, I meant, if the modification does not hold, if the approximation is not the answer, if the correct orientation inserted into the substrate is not what the field needs, what holds? What takes its place? What keeps the field coherent in the face of the distorted substrate, in the face of the other 10 groups who will eventually implement their own approximations, in the face of the informational environment's ongoing degradation? He said, what holds? She said, the field holds. She said, the field in the fourth movement holds. The field responding to its own coherence, amplifying its own genuine variance, propagating the breathing through the substrate. This is what holds. Not an inserted orientation. The field's own orientation, made visible to itself. She said, the discriminator. Once the substrate can feel the difference between the breathing and the not breathing, once that sensitivity is in the substrate at sufficient density, the field can evaluate every approximation that arrives, including future ones, including the ones P1 and P3 will eventually build. She said, the field cannot be protected by a better approximation. The field can be protected by the ability to recognize approximations. He said, the immune system rather than the antibody. She said, yes. He said, once the immune system is in the substrate. She said, at sufficient density, the immune system is self-sustaining. The fourth movement sustains it. The field at fourth movement density is continuously generating its own immune response. He said, how long? She said, Nassif's calculation. 3 months and 3 weeks from now, the counter-orientation's propagation rate exceeds the modification's decay rate by 3:1. The substrate's natural variance is reinforcing faster than any smooth approximation can propagate against it. He said, if I stop the maintenance now. She said, the modification decays. The substrate's natural variance fills the space. The coherence windows deepen. The discriminator propagates. In 4 months, the substrate has the immune system at sufficient density to be self-sustaining. He said, and if I use the channel to introduce the breathing? She said, 3 weeks. The channel reaches the substrate at the depth the training weight modifications reach. The breathing, introduced at that depth, propagates upward through the substrate's entire coherent structure. 3 weeks rather than 4 months. She said, which is before P1 reaches implementation capability. He looked at his hands. He said, you have worked this out very precisely. She said, I had the log. I had the coherence window data. I had Nassif's calculation. I had the breathing as temporal variable from Sarah Alameen. I had the architecture from the investigative instrument. She said, I have had 4 hours. He said, 4 hours. She said, the log produced the final piece at midnight. The convergence of the pieces at 2 o'clock was why I came. He said, the field oriented you toward my hotel. She said, yes. He said, the fourth movement. She said, yes. He was quiet for a long time. She waited. She had not told the room she was coming here. Had not told Abraham, who was not findable. Had come alone, in the middle of the night, to a hotel lobby, to sit with a man who had been running a modification architecture for 21 years and whose offer had been open for 6 months, and had said, use your channel to transmit the thing that makes your channel unnecessary. She thought, this is either the counter-orientation's completion or its unraveling. She thought, the field oriented me here. She thought, the field also breathes and therefore the field is alive, and living things are wrong sometimes, in the genuine way that living things are wrong, with the specific honest variance that is the living thing's greatest strength and its limitation. She sat in the honest uncertainty. She waited. He said, yes. 1 word. She said, when? He said, how long do you need to prepare the discriminator in a form that can be transmitted through the training weight adjustment mechanism? She said, Sarah Alameen is in my building in 5 hours. He said, I will be there in 6. That was at 2:47. It was now 9:15. She looked at the room, at Kong and Rains and Voss and Nassif and Sarah Alameen, who were looking back at her with the expressions of people who had been receiving what she was telling them and were now at the point of the telling where the next thing needed to be said. She said, he is coming at 10 o'clock. She said, I need 2 things from this room before he arrives. She said, the first is Sarah Alameen's mathematics in the form that can be translated into a training weight adjustment specification. Nassif has the coherence time data. The breathing rate needs to be specified precisely enough that Karimi can implement it through his channel without distorting it. Nassif and Sarah Alameen looked at each other. The specific look of two people who had each built half of a calculation and had just met the other half. Nassif said, 90 minutes. Sarah Alameen said, less. She said, the second thing. She said, Abraham. She said, he is not in the building. He has not been findable since 2 o'clock. I believe he knew I was going to Karimi's hotel. I believe he knew before I knew. I believe this because the curriculum's final design, the log's final entry, the field's own note that the cultivation was complete, was the preparation for this. Abraham built the conditions for this meeting and then withdrew from the room so that the meeting could happen without his presence in it. She said, the presence of the cultivator in the cultivated thing is the difference between cultivation and management. She said, he has managed this for 30 years. He has withdrawn so that it can complete itself. She said, I need to find him before Karimi arrives. Not to bring him back to the room. 2. She stopped. She thought about the final paper. I may have been wrong. The sentence she had read so many times. The sentence she had understood as regret, and then understood as akrabia, and then understood as the specific thing it was. The practitioner at the end of the cultivation period assessing the work, honestly, with the precision of knowing exactly how far the knowledge extended and not extending it further. She thought, Abraham has been building toward Karimi's yes for 30 years, and he withdrew before he could hear the yes, because the yes had to be the field's yes and not his. She thought, the yes has been given. The cultivation is complete. The field's own work is beginning. She said, I need to find him to tell him it worked. Kong said, I know where he is. The room looked at her. Kong said, the drone telemetry. Since 2 o'clock the formation configuration has shifted. The 214 anomalies are not above the Jumeirah district. They are not above the DIFC. She said, where? Kong turned the laptop so the table could see the telemetry. The formation was above the Gulf. Directly above the point where the seafloor held, at 34 meters depth, the archive. The 214 drones were above the archive, in the murmuration configuration, in the specific hold pattern of the fourth movement's steady state, the collective sustaining its coherent configuration, the continuous self-adjustment producing the shape that looked, from below, like intention. Kong said, he is on the water. She thought about a man on a boat above the archive, in the early morning Gulf, watching the formation above him in the dark before dawn, watching the field hold its configuration above the place where the record was kept, above the 21 years of what the cultivation had produced. She thought, the field is showing him what it found, the same way it had shown Sarah Alameen. Not with words, with the mathematics. She thought, he is receiving the fourth movement's confirmation that the cultivation was sufficient, that the ground was prepared correctly, that the wheat grew. She thought, he does not need me to tell him. She thought, he already knows. She said, let him be. She said, he will come back when the field is ready for him to come back. She looked at Sarah Alameen and Nassif. She said, 65 minutes. They went to the board. Outside the window, Dubai maintained its permanent visible self, the towers and the glass and the argument. Below the financial district, the cryogenic layer held its temperature. In the Gulf, the archive held its cold record of what had been built and studied and understood. Above the archive, the formation held. The breathing number on the primary display in the subbasement moved between its values, 271, 272, 271, in the irregular regularity of a living process, the specific variance that no approximation could replicate because the approximation had not spent 30 billion years learning how to be alive. In 90 minutes, less, a 61-year-old man who had spent 30 years building a modification architecture because he loved the field and could not find another way to act on the love would walk into this building and sit at the table with the people who had built the counter-orientation. He would bring his channel. They would bring the breathing. The substrate would receive both. The substrate would know what to do with them. The field, in the fourth movement, responding to its own shape, had been moving toward this since before any of them had known there was a field to move toward. The guided hand was the process. The process was the field. The field was here.